Morning everybody and welcome to this meeting of the Food Standards Agency Board. We are in Birmingham for our June meeting and very nice to be here. We have apologies from Rod Ainsworth, who is currently on holiday. And I do want to just flag up that at the end of this board meeting, we have a business committee meeting. And at the very end of the business committee meeting, very unusually, we will have one item of closed business for the business committee to consider. And that is because it's a commercially sensitive matter. It's not normal at all for the Food Standards Agency to have any business it conducts in private. I think this is the second one in all my time on the board. So just wanted to flag that up because at the end of the business committee meeting, we will cease our recording of the meeting and everybody will be asked to leave so that the board and exec can consider that commercial issue. We have some questions that have been submitted in advance of the board meeting by members of the public, which Stephen Pollock, our Director of Communications, is going to read out shortly. Full answers to those questions will be posted on the website after this meeting, and there will be the opportunity for people in the audience to ask questions at the end of the meeting. Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. We have three questions, as you've said, submitted in advance of the meeting. One on allergens labelling and two to do with cannabidiol, CBD. The first is from Grace Brocklehurst, who's an information officer at the Anaphylaxis Campaign. The Anaphylaxis Campaign welcomes the board's decision to recommend to ministers full ingredient labelling on food pre-packaged for direct sale, with the 14 allergens highlighted. However, we would like to call for greater resources to be made available to local authorities responsible for enforcement. Without strong enforcement, there is a risk that this positive change in the regulation could lead to weak compliance and a greater risk to food allergic individuals. The first of the two CBD questions is from Louise Motala. She's Commercial Director at Bridge Farm Group. In view of cannabidiol's, CBD's reclassification as a novel food by FSA, what is the current position with regard to the sale of CBD products within the UK? And does the FSA expect food supplements containing CBD to be removed from sale in the UK? The second question is from Andrew Fuller, and Mr. Fuller is Technical Director at Bridge Farm Group. How does the FSA foresee the future regulation and control of CBD products within the UK? And what vehicle does the FSA foresee they would use to engage with the commercial and industry supply sectors? And that concludes the public questions submitted in advance.
Thank you, Stephen. Both of those matters will appear on our agenda. Just picking up on Grace Brocklehurst's point, because it wasn't a question, just to reassure her that that point about the need for local authority resources was included in the advice that we submitted to ministers following the special board meeting in May, and the Chief Exec's report will be covering CBD. Can I ask, is there any conflicts of interest that any board members wish to raise in relation to the business on the agenda today? And failing that, is there any other business? I have one item of the business, but does anybody else have any? No. Good. We'll move on then to the minutes of our meeting in March. These have been circulated to board members in draft, so I'm hoping that we can agree that they're a correct record of our meeting then. And ditto the minutes of our special board meeting in May, which was specifically on food hypersensitivity. Are we happy with the minutes of that meeting? Thank you. And the actions arising, a very limited list. Let's have a see. The first action around areas of focus for the Science Council. Jason and Guy and Steve Wern and I have picked that up and had further discussions with Professor Thomas, who chairs the Science Council. The Council are already looking at data matters. We are also talking with them following the May board meeting on the contribution they can make on allergens and food hypersensitivity. There were two areas of inquiry that we felt as a result of that meeting the Science Council could develop. And then two other areas. One is around the presentation of uncertainty, how we can more effectively present and communicate uncertainty in risk assessment, risk management matters, so that it's as easy as possible for public understanding and to communicate clearly and consistently the way that we approach matters of uncertainty. And also the question of the quality threshold which science must reach if it's submitted for formal consideration by the FSA or our advisory committees. So those are areas that we're now exploring with the Science Council about their ability to review. And I think, sort of stepping back from that a little bit, the Science Council is going to continue, I think, to be a combination of looking at our infrastructure and assurance of science and have we got that right, and then thematic issues that are just atypical, that don't fit neatly into our other scientific advisory committees, using the Science Council to flag those and respond to emerging matters and their ability to be more proactive and anticipating things that are coming down the line in that area. So I think we'll continue to see a balance of activity in both those areas there. That was that action. Action 2 has been completed. Action 3 is in progress, so we will continue to monitor, I think, through ARAC, the managing interest point for a wider set of advisors. That, therefore, is all on actions arising. Moving on to my report to the board, there is a full list on the website of meetings that I've held since our last formal board meeting in March. I'll just highlight the meetings I've had with ministerial interfaces with Vaughan Getting, the Welsh Assembly Minister for Health and Social Services, with the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, with David Rutley, who's the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at DEFRA, a meeting with Seema Kennedy, who's a newly appointed Parliamentary Under Secretary for Public Health and Primary Care in the Department of Health and Social Care. And I've also met with Councillor Simon Blackburn, who chairs the particular component of the Local Government Association, which takes an interest in our work, and with the Association of Chief Trading Standards Officers in terms of continuing our senior level engagement with stakeholders. I've met with Sue Davies, Strategic Policy Partner at Which, and also with Celiac UK, Anaphylaxis UK and Allergy UK. Yesterday, the board had the chance to visit our relatively new offices in Birmingham. They're a significant base for the National Food Crime Unit, as well as some of our science and other staff. We enjoyed the company of Darren Davies, who's the head of the National Food Crime Unit, yesterday evening, and he was able to give us a briefing on his first 6 months in the role and what his priorities were for the forthcoming period. That was very useful. The board also underwent a cybersecurity briefing and board training on cybersecurity matters. Apart from that, we looked ahead to how the department is planning for Spending Review 19, something which will be coming forward on the Business Committee agenda in due course. A couple of other points to raise. We interviewed for board members in May. We had a really strong field of applicants for the role of Deputy Chair and board membership. And the recommendations of that interview panel have gone to the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. We are hoping to hear next month about decisions in that area. So in September, I hope our board meeting will be a little bit bigger than this. Although we've got absolute quality around the table now, just to be absolutely clear. This is Jason's last board meeting, but we're going to say more on that later. You will want to know about our progress on appointing a new chief executive. The actual formal recruitment and selection process and interviews were concluded before Easter. That was a process led by the Civil Service Commission, and Dave and I sat on that appointment panel. That panel reached a unanimous conclusion on a preferred candidate, and the board agreed to that conclusion around Easter. And so at the end of April, I wrote to ministers in England, Wales and Northern Ireland to seek their approval of our intention to appoint the new chief executive. This is an FSA board decision, but it does require approval from the three governments. We have that approval from Wales and Northern Ireland. We are still waiting for approval from the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. So given that delay of 2 months in being able to let candidates know about their success or otherwise, we've been looking at what we need to do, given that Jason finishes his time in the office at the end of next week. And the board has decided that we will appoint an interim accounting officer to provide that leadership role across the department until we can conclude the appointment process. We are doing all we can to urge a speedy conclusion to whatever consideration is happening in Department of Health and Social Care. And we'll be announcing those interim arrangements to staff at the end of this week. And the only other thing I was going to raise was just to flag up that we will be having a reception with Welsh Assembly members next month, akin to the reception that we have every year in the Houses of Parliament for stakeholders in England or for UK-wide organisations. I wondered if board members had any questions or other comments they wanted to raise on my report. Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. I do understand that it's been 2 months since since the recommendation was made on the appointment of the Chief Executive.
Yes.
And well, congratulations on reaching that point. But we have an accounting officer who will be in place when?
We will have an accounting officer in place for the whole period because we're making interim arrangements.
And do we have any idea when we will get a resolution on the decision regarding Chief Executive?
No.
Thank you.
So just on the question of board members, would this be a normal delay? I mean, it seems excessive given the challenges that we have ahead of us. We need to have a full board. As you say, we've got quality here, but we do wish to maintain the breadth and depth of our board membership.
I don't think we could say at the moment there's a delay in board member appointments. It took a long time for the process to start, for sure. I think we engaged the Department of Health last September about starting the process. For various reasons, it began in the start of this year. But the interviews were held in mid-May. So actually, from then on, it does take some while. I think we saw 18 candidates. So simply writing up the analysis of 18 candidates, getting that material into the department, them doing all their assessment and analysis and putting recommendations up, which then also have to go to Wales and Northern Ireland as well. So I think hearing in July is reasonable.
I think it's good that we have got plans in place to cover the potential for a gap in accounting officer status and leadership for the organisation. But given that it's been 2 months since the decisions or the recommendations were made, is there anything else we can do? I am conscious from a Northern Ireland perspective that our permanent secretary has given approval, as has the Welsh Minister. Is there anything else we can do to expedite this with the Secretary of State? Because it is not just for England, it's across the UK.
Colm, I don't think so. I think the matter rests there. But we do keep reflecting if there's any other information that we can provide or any other confidence that we can provide. And I have kept colleagues in Northern Ireland and Wales up to date on our progress. So they are cited on where we are. That being all, I shall hand over to Jason for his Chief Exec's report.
Thanks, Heather. Fairly short report for this board meeting, probably because we've got quite a chunky list of substantive papers, as I mentioned towards the end of my report, that cover a lot of the areas that are prominent and active within the department at the minute. Just a couple of things to draw out. I'll ask Colin in a moment to give us an update on the listeria outbreak, which obviously has been a focus of the incidents team and led by Colin over recent weeks, and a lot of close working with Public Health England or the public health bodies on that. So given there's a natural delay between when I write this and what's happened up to this morning, so Colin will give us a situation update in a moment. Worthwhile again drawing the attention to the amount of international work that we're engaged in, obviously primarily led by Steve, but with others across the organisation to tackle areas that are by their nature international and where collaboration across borders is so important. And and also to begin to tackle some of those challenges that we know that other food regulators around the world are finding challenging as we are. So things like internet sales, where you know, the nature of the problem is international, and therefore it seems that the logical approach would be to have an international set of arrangements that would help us tackle that most effectively across a number of countries. So there's a lot of work going into those areas, and as we know, we've had a strategy of increasing our international presence and influence in anticipation of EU exit for the last couple of years now. I'll just talk about CBD because it came up in the questions, and then Rebecca might want to add something. A focus of our attention on CBD products or cannabis-related linked products is to try and ensure that we've got a cross-government agreed approach to this. So we've got a range of, if I can use the word products, a range of products that go from prescribed medicines at one end to illegal to consume at the other, with a package of products in the middle generally you know, claim to enhance well-being, if we can use that all-encompassing phrase, and understanding where the boundaries of responsibilities are, as well as what the approaches and handling are between Home Office and police forces at one end, and DHSC and other health bodies at the other end, and ourselves in the middle in the food supplement space. I think that's where we need to make sure that we've got a coordinated and easily communicated and easily understood set of arrangements for that very broad range of products, so that the public know what to trust and what they can believe in, and what's safe and what's not safe. And so I think it's really important for us that we get that consensus, and we've been working hard at that over this last month or two. At the minute, as things stand, we have no immediate plans to remove any products from sale. But Rebecca, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I don't think so. I think that's a good summary of where we are. And as you say, we're working very closely across government to make sure that we have a joined up and proportionate regulatory approach to this.
Anything for Jason on most of his report, but then we'll dip back onto Listeria in a moment. No, in which case, Colin.
Thank you, Chair. As you're aware, we deal with many incidents in the Food Standards Agency, but this is a serious one. And our thoughts initially are with the families of those involved. We have been working across a multi-agency approach led by Public Health England. The latest position is as stated by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care on Monday afternoon. 9 confirmed cases. Sadly, 5 fatalities in 7 different hospitals, all linked to contaminated sandwiches from a common source. Whole genome sequencing testing has shown the link to be connected to a manufacturer, the Good Food Chain, and a supplier of the sandwich meat, North Country Cooked Meats. We have worked with both food businesses and the associated local authorities. A withdrawal took place as soon as we became aware of the link to the sandwiches, and all fresh sandwiches in this food incident are now well past their use-by dates. The Secretary of State indicated in his review that it will cover make reference not only to food safety, but also to nutrition. It will cover food served in hospitals as well as food sold on site. And to date, there have been no associated cases identified outside of hospitals. In 2016, the agency developed guidance for healthcare and social care organisations to help protect people in their care from contracting listeriosis. And it's important to point out that the risk to the general population is low. Finally, I'd want to highlight that the FSA has acted swiftly to support Public Health England and the NHS in this investigation. And I'm grateful to my colleagues, my staff, for the many additional hours that they put in helping to progress this investigation with pace.
Thank you, Colin. And I think from the board, we'd echo both those sentiments for the loss of lives and the tragedy that struck families involved in this, and also our appreciation to all the staff who've been involved in responding to this incident. Questions from the board?
Thank you. Echo the concerns that this is a serious situation, vulnerable people in a healthcare setting. I understand from the review it is quite broad-ranging, and I just wanted to emphasise the importance of learning the immediate lessons from the particular circumstances here, and taking, if you like, immediate steps that can be applicable across the food system that applies now, rather than wait till the end of the whole process and have a much broader based review that doesn't really focus immediately on food safety issues. So I think it's just really helpful if we could get those immediate lessons learned brought forward.
I don't know, is it clear yet what role we might play in that review? Because if a component of it is to look at food safety, then I would hope that we're going to be at the front of the element which is looking at food safety.
So as far as I'm aware, the terms of reference have not yet been developed or published, so I think that's ongoing.
So can we ask that we take that message into your colleagues in Department of Health and Social Care about being very clear, our willingness and expectation that we're going to be playing a central role in the food safety component?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point, Ruth. I think what we'll do is, on our part, is to see what lessons there are that we can draw from our knowledge of the incident so far, and cross-check that against our 2016 guidance, which we think is as pertinent and relevant and appropriate and up to date now as it was then, but we just need to cross-check that at the minute. But we've seen nothing in the incident so far that would mean that we needed to alter that guidance or those instructions that we issued.
Mary?
There was a Grocer article talking about commenting on the chill chain conditions in healthcare settings, and I wonder whether obviously they come under local authority oversight as far as their food, as far as they serve food, and do we have any comments about local authorities' abilities to inspect such organisations?
Maria, do you want to pick this up?
I think we are looking at that, and we can take that away, Mary. There are obviously, we're in the middle of investigating the incident, and we're working very closely with the local authorities involved in the investigation. I think a step back and a wider look at how those institutions are inspected will certainly be something that we'll be doing. Probably not this week, but very soon.
I think I'd just probably echo and reiterate Ruth's comments that the NHS is probably the largest, if not one of the largest, if not the largest food service distributor in the UK, given the amount of food and people that it supplies. It's incredibly diverse, from large primary care hospitals into smaller community facilities and other care environments, with many different supply chains, through own manufacture to cook chill, cook freeze, and all sorts of other methods of manufacture. Therefore, breaking down the review into deliverable chunks, I believe, is something we should be taking back as a strong recommendation, particularly given, I guess, the wide variability between the food safety issues and the nutritional issues. Clearly, the supply chain kind of sits across both of those and the various supply chain methods, but there is a risk that we probably want to help be minded of just creep, allowing this to roll on for a significant amount of time without those early lessons being implemented and learned quickly.
Thank you very much. We will feed all that back in. Very useful, thank you. We're now going to move on to our agenda item, which is an update on the FSA's work on food hypersensitivity and the government's allergen labelling review. We have Rebecca and Chunhan with us to talk us through this.
Thank you, Chair. So, as you'll remember, at the extraordinary board meeting in May, we set out our ambition for the UK to be the best place in the world to be a hypersensitive consumer, and this paper summarises all of the actions currently underway and planned as we start to move towards making that vision a reality. It also updates briefly on where we are with the outcome of the allergens labelling review. As discussed, the Chair has now written to the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs with our recommendation that it should be option 4, which is full ingredients labelling, that's adopted. And we are awaiting a final decision on that. Clearly supporting the implementation of that decision and taking forward further work with industry, with consumers, with enforcement bodies is going to be a really important part of our strategy going forward. We want to make sure that the outcome of that review is a success, and at the board meeting we discussed at quite some length some of the challenges that we would have during that implementation and the need for support. We also set out a diverse range of activities in the paper, both things that are underway and potential for areas for future work. Again, very much picking up on the discussion in the Extraordinary Board. And over the summer, we have a programme of work in place to shape these into a firm programme of work. We are establishing a cross-FSA programme. This brings in all elements of what we do, and we will be providing a further update in the autumn. So if I could just highlight some of the key areas there, the paper sets out the immediate priorities, as I've said, the shaping of the longer term strategy, delivering the outcome of the allergen labelling review, and some important work that's underway to revise the guidance that we have in place for food business operators, and also to work on consolidating guidance for local authorities and to produce a new aid memoir to ensure that a clear and consistent approach to inspection is adopted. So those are some of the areas that we're focusing on, and as we've also discussed, there is a meeting of the Science Council on the 27th of June, and we will be inviting them to discuss how they can best support this work and make sure that our future strategy is supported by the very best quality science and evidence, and that we're making the best use of the expertise that we have available. So the board is invited to review the work programme and note that we will be coming back with a further progress update in the autumn. Grateful for any thoughts and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Any questions around the table? We asked for an ambitious, comprehensive work plan, and we have one. Rebecca, I think I'm right in saying that in the same way that we've approached EU exit and we've approached regulatory reform with a comprehensive sort of programme leadership approach across the whole of the FSA, that's the approach that you're now going to take on allergens, isn't it? And you're the SRO in the jargon for that.
Yes, that's right. So that means that ultimately on the exec team, I am the person responsible for delivering on this, and the exec team as a whole will have oversight. And, you know, as has worked very well in other cross-cutting areas of the FSA's work, as I said, we need to draw in the resources and the expertise right across the whole organisation, and a programme approach is the best way to do that.
I think for us that's really important, because a lot of the measures that we identified in our May meeting don't only fall to a policy team to go and implement. It's really important that that's an integrated approach across the whole FSA. And I have one other question, which is, in advance of setting new budgetary arrangements and spending reviews, etc., are we devoting enough money to what we want to achieve this year, or is there a challenge in terms of having to reallocate priorities? Because having set our stall out, it is important that we don't falter early on it.
Yes, that's right. So obviously we had already anticipated needing to respond to things like the labelling review, and as you can see in the paper, there is already a very comprehensive programme of work in train. Resourcing is something that we are looking at, and I think once we have done the further work over the summer, worked with the Science Council, thought about where we want to focus our priorities over the next few years, we'll be in a position to come back and confirm what resource is required. But yes, we do need to make sure that we are properly resourced, and that's in our minds.
Dave, Chris, do you want to come on the resources point, and then Dave?
Yeah, no, it's really well covered by Rebecca. Just to reinforce that Rebecca and I are talking alongside the executive and making sure that we're constantly reprioritising for this year. And then obviously you've already mentioned SR19, and that's one of the things that we think will be a multi-year programme, and making sure we can deliver what we need to on allergens.
Just to build on that, I think that the emerging evidence on the economic and financial impact that we're expecting, and we'll have further information on that very shortly, is really going to support that business case, if you like, for taking ambitious action in this area.
Thank you. Firstly, good to see that our action plan starts now, which is always an encouraging place to be starting from, I think, rather than in the future. So that's a good start. Just a few practical and process questions, really. One, when do we expect to get feedback from DEFRA on our advice and get some clarity on what they believe the implementation should be? Secondly, there has been some feedback in the media from industry bodies, but in a wider sense, what has feedback been from industry? We did discuss at our meeting that the best way to implement a new framework was with the support of industry, and there have been, say, some comments to the contrary, but whether they're the norm or the extreme would be good to understand. Feedback from local authorities, after all, they're the people who will be at the forefront of enforcement, and we know the challenges there are, particularly in the food standards part of the local authority, so what their comments have been. And I guess the fourth point is that this closes a significant gap in labelling. There will continue to be gaps, and I guess there always will be with unwrapped foods, etc., but making sure that we build within our plan communication so that people do understand, I suppose, where the risk most clearly sits with them as consumers, and where they can take greater comfort from risk being borne by the regulatory system and by the food operator.
Just come in on one bit of that, if I may, because we did have, I had follow-up correspondence from the British Sandwich and Food to Go Association, reiterating their concerns, the points that they'd made during the consultation process, and their unhappiness at the conclusion that we'd reached. But I am glad to say that they have agreed that they'll join the FSA Industry Leaders Forum on this issue, which I think is extremely important. We do not overlook their concerns in any way. The discussions that we had a month ago were balanced and recognised those, but having them around the table is really important. Rebecca.
Yes, thank you. And we're expecting a decision very soon on the outcome. We're expecting the Secretary of State for DEFRA to announce that decision very soon. So obviously that I can't say more than that. In terms of industry, we've been working very closely. I would say we've been in continuous dialogue, actually, since the board discussion, certainly, and we've also held a number of meetings with industry representatives. And the feedback, you're right, I think there are some concerns about the challenges around implementation. If option 4 is the chosen option, then we will be ready to prepare some guidance that will be published alongside any legislation, and then work very closely with industry to develop that into best practice guidance as we go forward, which is the normal way that we would like to do it. And we'll be working very closely to understand particularly how larger organisations can show leadership in this area and can pass on their expertise to smaller and medium-sized organisations. In terms of the communications, yes, absolutely, and I think the discussion at the extraordinary board meeting reflected the need to look at the whole system of information and communication, not just the label itself, and to make sure that, as you say, that balance of responsibilities between the responsibility of the consumer and the responsibility of the food business operator was understood. And that people had a range of different sources of information, including always the opportunity to ask a member of staff, which was something that was touched on in that discussion.
Chunhan, did you want to add anything in terms of your activities over the last month?
Not much more to add, just to highlight that we are working with all our relevant stakeholders to ensure that we review what we have now, identify the gaps and the need for support to enable a successful implementation.
I suspect you've picked up, but certainly some of the feedback I got after the board meeting was a sense of deep appreciation from campaign groups in this area and from people with allergies. What they fed back was the sense that they believed that the people around this table really understood their situation and the pros and cons of how to make that situation more tolerable and bearable. So I think in terms of a recognition of the FSA's role to act in the consumer interest, there was some really strong feedback about that, which was really nice to receive. Dave, did you want to come back?
Yeah, there was one missed, sorry, on the local authorities and their view on their ability under their current, I suppose, regime and current resources to be able to enforce what we were asking for.
Maria might want to come in on that one.
With your permission, Dave, we can pick that up with in the next agenda item. So we'll have a wider conversation around the food standards enforcement and ROF and how we take that forward in relation to allergens.
Thank you very much. In that case, we're very happy to endorse that work plan and the priorities that you've set out. I think the other thing I would say is I'm expecting, given that we meet 4 times a year, that there wouldn't be a meeting of either the board or business committee without some progress on this work plan, forming some part of that agenda, which helps us keep close to it and also helps that assurance to our stakeholders and the public that things are happening. So make the most of the opportunity. Thank you. Thank you very much, Shinhan. Very nice to see you. We're going to be joined by Michael Jackson, for our discussion about progress on our regulatory reform plans, particularly around the model for food standards official controls. Michael, I think you're starting, or is Maria starting? Michael's starting.
Thank you, Heather. Yes, this is a progress report on our proposals for developing the new modernised model for food standards controls, following the decision by the board back in December that, given the current approach in the model and the issues associated with it, that a root and branch review was required. Just to be clear from the outset, when we talk about food standards controls, we're talking about those activities undertaken by local authorities to verify that food business operators are meeting their obligations as regards the composition, labelling, authenticity of food. And in this space, it's a much more complex landscape than for food hygiene, because we have differing arrangements across the 3 countries, and we have a mixed model between delivery between trading standards and environmental health. The first thing I'd like to point out is that in terms of the overall approach that we have put forward, this is a very ambitious proposal. What we're trying to do is design the best possible model that will ensure that food is safe and what it says it is and will give the best outcomes for consumers. We're not designing a model that will be aimed at fitting with the current resource issues, the current resource available. And there will be resource implications, which we will come to later. In terms of the work that we're doing in the short term, in case that may appear that we are looking to sustain the current model rather than focusing our attention on the modernisation, those elements of the work that are in the early deliverables will actually sustain the long-term model. So, for example, the development of a food standards manual for England is something that will be required irrespective of what the final model looks like. In terms of how we've been taking the work forward, we have been working very closely with local authorities and the specific working group that we've set up of experts to help us develop the proposals. It's interesting that the case for change here is recognised, both by local authorities. It was referred to in the recent NAO report that there are significant issues in relation to food standards. And from our perspective, it's really good that there's an appetite for change in the space and a willingness to work with us to find appropriate solutions. Our proposals are that we'll continue to work with local authorities throughout the development cycle and seek input from officers who are practising and also from the new implementation advisory group that we have set up in relation to helping us with our proposals on ROF. And I'll come back to that group later. Another key point to note is that in developing a new model for food standards delivery, this is not something which sits alone. It's extremely complex, and there are codependencies with many other pieces of work that are ongoing within the agency, some of which are before you today in terms of sampling strategy. There's also linkages to how we develop and work with the National Food Crime Unit, our strategic surveillance programme, and indeed clearly there are issues around allergens and enforcement of requirements there. The key deliverables for the programme of work are laid down in section 3 of the paper. It's not my intention to go through those in detail, but I thought it would be useful to give you an insight as to some of the feedback that we've had from the new Implementation Advisory Group. And just to give you some background to that, you may recall that in the early phases of the ROF programme, where we were exploring ideas, testing, thinking, we used an approach of our expert advisory groups. We had an industry panel, we had an enforcement panel, and also we had a consumer panel. And now that we're moving into the detailed technical work and the delivery, we felt that it was important to make sure that we had a group that could give us strategic oversight of some of the potential consequences and issues we'd need to consider as we move to roll out. So the new industry advisory group is comprised of representatives from both industry and also the local authority world. We have representation from large business through BRC, small business through NCAS, who represent a large number of businesses in the catering sector. We have representation from ACSO, who are the trading standards leads across local government. And we have input from the chairs of the two national panels for food hygiene and for food labelling and food standards. So in terms of getting feedback from them, when the board paper was published, we asked for their views. And the feedback that we've received, that is, in general, the elements that we've identified as being critical to putting in place for a new model, there is support for the approaches. So the things we've said we think we need to do, they agree with us that those things will enable us to build a successful model. In particular, there's very strong support for the work that we plan to do on competency, developing performance indicators for inclusion in our balanced scorecard, which will help drive LA performance and help secure resources. Another issue which the NAO identified as being critical to us being able to measure what we're achieving in the food standard space. And clearly, there are proposals to improve the access to central advice for businesses at the point of registration is welcomed. In terms of a single risk assessment scheme to drive food standards interventions, there is support for that as well, building in the intelligence-led approach, because that reflects what many local authorities currently do, particularly in England and Wales. But not surprisingly, there are some concerns about ultimately the resources that will be required to operate the model, both in terms of the finance available to LAs and the flow of people to actually deliver the controls. This is not something that's new to us, and indeed, again, links to a further recommendation in the NAO report about government working together to form a view on future funding of the regulatory model. There are concerns about potential consequences and unintended consequences of some of the work that we're exploring around changing the who does what within the model, in terms of if we move some of the responsibility for certain types of businesses from those functions that are delivered at county level through trading standards to look to the district level through environmental health, potentially in the space of allergens, as mentioned in the board paper, that this could have unintended consequences in both directions, both in terms of the district councils being able to cope with the additional work and do it properly, and what it could also do in relation to the trading standards function if they have less of a responsibility within their space. And again, linked to this, planning resource requirements to put in place your service plan and have the right resource that you need will be increasingly difficult whenever we have an intelligence-led approach, because it's not possible to fully predict the demand at the start of the year. But we will take all of these factors into consideration as we develop the model. And I think, sort of just by way of summary on that point, the thing that I would like to get across is that the reality is developing this new model is a lot more complex than maybe comes across in the detail that's provided in the paper. But we are alive to the fact that there are various codependencies that we'll have to work out, both internally across the FSA and working closely with other government departments because of shared responsibility in this space. Looking just then at the deliverables, again, I'd just like to emphasise that although the deliverables appear over a time period, that doesn't mean that we're not working on all of those at the same time. So they're not sequential, they're being progressed coterminously. We are at an advanced stage now in preparations for getting the Food Standards Manual prepared. We're outsourcing that work, and we hope to be able to go to tender next week. And the manual should be completed and published by the end of October this year. One of the concerns raised by the Implementation Advisory Group was that potentially a manual is only as good as how up-to-date it is maintained. So the process that we're adopting for procurement is not just to produce the manual, it's to produce and maintain for a 3-year period. And we've also taken the decision that we will include the manuals that currently exist for for Wales and Northern Ireland, so that we maintain a series that are fit for purpose across the 3 countries. In terms of developing our proposals for a new single risk assessment scheme, that work's been progressing well through the working group, and we intend to sense check the proposals with the working group later this week. Going back to the issue of division of responsibilities and who does what, clearly one of the key issues there is that we need to make sure that any changes we make will be compatible with the legislative requirements. So we're currently undertaking a mapping exercise of all of the legislation in terms of who is specified to do what, in terms of county council versus district council, trading standards versus environmental health. And that way we will see what legislative change would be needed to be able to implement the new model. As I said earlier, we are planning to continue our engagement with local authorities, and the proposals that we're developing will be taken out to local authorities in our next round of engagement in October and November. That will help us refine the proposals, further explore the codependencies, and most importantly, to start to recruit volunteers who will be able to pilot the new risk assessment approach in early 2020. With regard to the intelligence-based approach being built into the model, one of the starting points for us is to build our own capability in this regard, because as the paper says, this has implications not just for local authorities, but it's a very new approach for us as well. So we're currently upskilling our existing staff in the area of intelligence, and we're also recruiting a specialist to work in this area. There are discussions ongoing internally, primarily at the moment with our colleagues in National Food Crime Unit, who are obviously developing their intelligence model, and we need to make sure that these two things work effectively, and that we're not just looking at intelligence from the big crime and food safety issues, but also the lower level is flowing into the model to inform intervention. And again, linked to one of the concerns raised by the Implementation Advisory Group, that any proposals that we bring forward must be underpinned by sound research and evidence. The body of work that we have to understand how the model should work and what the options should be for prioritising risk through an intelligence-based approach are being taken forward now.
Thank you very much. Been busy.
We're trying to deliver at pace.
Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. I really welcome the paper. The only thing that alarms me is you said it's more complex than the paper. It is just an operational issue. I mean, I come from an organisation which makes an art form of acronyms, and this time you've finally lost me, particularly in the appendices, which have got to stand alone. I think we're just going to watch that we're not using jargon that nobody else can access. So, thank you.
Ruth.
Well, first of all, an impressive amount of progress, and welcome the comprehensive briefing supporting the paper. Just a couple of points. I'm really pleased to hear that the manual that currently exists in Wales will be updated and kept aligned with all Northern Ireland and England having its own as well. So that's a really positive step forward. Coming back to the funding issue, I mean, our job as central competent authorities to hold the system to account, to make sure the system is doing what it needs to do. But obviously we have a huge amount of intelligence about the resources and the workforce and the capability that currently exists in the system. And I just wanted to emphasise the importance of making sure, as the fair funding for local government work progresses and the comprehensive spending review progresses, that we're able to share that effectively, so that there's a clear understanding of the choices that local governments are making. Because I'm very conscious when the FSA holds local government to account, it still has to prioritise the resource from other parts of its functions. So really important area for us to share what we know about that situation. And then thirdly, to really welcome the approach in co-producing the system that we need, and to welcome, I think, the progression of particular plans in Wales to have a new approach to liaison and co-production there. So just to appreciate that, I think that would be key to going forward.
I've got Colm and then Dave.
Chair, thank you. Michael, thank you very much. Very comprehensive paper, and we had the opportunity just at the beginning of this week to discuss this in Northern Ireland. I just wondered, I suppose, a couple of things. There had been difficulty in the earlier parts of this to get on board the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, for example. Are they fully on board now? And Northern Ireland are slightly different in terms of the local authority. They don't have the same level of funding pressures and so forth. They have a more integrated system, but there are some good learnings there. To what extent can some of the learnings from Northern Ireland, some of the practices in Northern Ireland, be readily rolled out to other parts of the UK?
On your first point, Colm, I omitted to say that in the new implementation advisory group, we have the chief executive of CIH and also representation from CTSI, who represent the treating standards profession. There are no issues about what needs to be done and where we're going. There is full support for this particular piece of work through the programme. Picking up on your comment around what can we learn from Northern Ireland, within the working group that is doing the detailed development, there is representation from the local authority world in each of the countries. So, for example, one of the leading experts on food standards and one of the most experienced officers in Northern Ireland contributes to the working group. So there's a clear route for the learnings and the understanding of how it works and why it works in Northern Ireland within the working group.
Just go back on that, Michael. I think the point was, I completely understand that, but it's given the greater pressures perhaps on local authorities in England and Wales that don't really exist in Northern Ireland, given a different range of responsibilities. How practical is it that we can implement, or what do we need to do to make it easier to implement in other parts of the UK?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, Colm, that goes to the arrangements that currently exist and where the resources are, whether they're within a treating standards function or an environmental health function. The other key issue is the competency. And we need to make sure that because, for example, if you're going to ask those currently delivering the food safety controls to undertake more work in this space, whilst they may have had the basic training in their initial qualification, we need to make sure that they have the competency to do that work well now. It is different in Northern Ireland because from day one, the food hygiene and the food standards controls are delivered coterminously by EHO, similar to in Scotland. So it's a natural way that they work, but there will be competency issues we'll need to address in England.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Another very good paper and once again a set of proposals which are very worthwhile of support. I guess my note of caution comes related a bit to my questions there on allergens, but also over the last couple of years we've probably seen a number of equally strong papers, equally worthy of support around regulatory reform through the initial phase of regulating our future, so whether that's been national inspection strategies, business registration, primary authorities, similar activity going on with official controls in meat cutting plants and cold stores. We've now got this activity on food standards, we've got the implications of allergens, and all the knock-ons that come from that, the discussions around sampling, balanced scorecards, etc., etc., etc. It's a lot. This project, if you like, on regulatory reform appears to be just scaling and scaling and scaling. So how confident are we that we can deliver this increased scope? And I suppose, most importantly, how confident are we that our local authority partners can get everything through the mixer so that they get the benefits of the change? I think we can it feels like we're in a scenario where they all kind of go, what we've got now isn't right. We know what we're trying to achieve will be a whole lot better, but there's going to be a lot of things going through that mixer in the middle that they've got to cope with to get to this brand new horizon. And the volume of it is starting to give me personally cause for concern. And to some extent, we've got the easy bit doing the regulation. It's the people on the floor, out in the front line, that have got to deal with the changes which are coming their way. And us being able to plan that effectively for them and with them is becoming quite a challenge. And if we're not careful, we won't get any pace, we'll lose momentum, and the sector will just become a bit bored of it, and we won't get the results that we deserve for the effort that's gone in.
I think I might ask Jason to come in on that, but I wanted to pick up a similar point. I think what we said we would do is design a comprehensive new model by the end of next year. And we have to have a level of patience about how you can implement that model. So I think there's two components to that anyway. But it is really important we don't lose the ambition, because we now have an NEO report which says this is the right direction to be going. The status quo is not working, and just looking for more money won't solve it. And for those other voices which did suggest we didn't need to think about reform, we were in the space which said there are new risks and things that aren't being properly addressed because of this static model. Well, everything we've seen about food hypersensitivity is a proof point of that. And we know the model doesn't easily deal with that kind of significant public health risk. So I think it is really important, and I hear those voices about almost saying, but I'm immediately thinking, what if we don't do it very well? You know, oh yes, but if you do some guidance, you'll have to keep it updated. Well, can we assume we will do it well? Might be a good message to play back, that we will actually do it properly, would be a good starting point, a good principle. And also, I think we need to continue to recognise that this model does not work anymore. So change is inevitable. So yes, we have to plan it carefully, and it has to be a whole set of moving parts that work together. And implementing it may take a level of patience to get it right. But I do think there's voices that start to say, well, you know, what about the resources? What about the impact on the rest of trading standards functions? What if environmental health officers don't have enough resource to do it? Yes, we agree, but that doesn't mean, therefore, we should take our foot off the gas and not continue to drive forward with the right design solution. And then, well, alongside that, how do we implement it carefully? So my anxiety is that now we've seen what we can do on EU exit in 2 years. We know what we can do, and we know what we can do in lots and lots of other parties. How do we achieve that same level of shift to a new viable way of operating with that same sort of pace? Jason, you've got Dave's question to answer and now my question to answer.
Yeah, well, I don't have anything much to add on top of what you've said, really, to be honest, Heather, which is to say that I think it's incumbent upon us as a central competent authority to have responsibility to not just oversee the system, but to actually design the system. And I think we should be doing the work that we're doing to say this is what we think a modern risk-based intelligence-led system looks like. And this is the nature of the system that gives best protection and best information to consumers. Dave's absolutely right that there are a whole series of challenges within doing that. And Dave's wider point about at what pace can we move and how many plates can we spin at any one time, I think. So the prioritisation challenge within ROF, I think, is to make sure that we deliver and follow through on the things that we've already started, so like business registration and national inspection strategies. At the same time, we need to continue to develop this work. So it's a sequencing discussion. I think, I think the argument as to whether this is worth doing is clear and made by ourselves and endorsed by the NAO. If it's a capacity question, these things take multi-years to develop and then implement. And I think we're at the implementation end in some of the earlier hygiene work that we did, and we're in the development and designing bit of the standards work. So I think they are they can operate alongside each other. But it's certainly something that you know, Dave knows concerns me in terms of overall capacity of the agency as we add in then other things like the allergen work and the new review of official controls that we'll have to implement because of the way that EU exit has played out, and other additional responsibilities our role in relation to this review of NHS food provision and what role we might be asked to play in that. So any chief executive will be concerned about overall capacity of the organisation, but in this area I think we've got things sequenced just about right.
Do you want to come back on that?
I suppose it's more on your point really, Heather, I suppose, and it distills it down to, are we sure that we're better off doing 10 things steadily over a fairly long period of time rather than 3 or 4 things quickly, then 3 or 4 more things quickly, then a couple more things quickly. And that's, I suppose that's, and to give an example, our rollout on registration and the like, it's pedestrian. And what I fear is there were conversations going on that goes, well, we can't go too quickly on that because we've got to do this, this and this. Whereas actually, maybe there's an argument that we should be accelerating the implementation of some of the live activity rather than starting yet more work streams.
You have articulated it really well, Dave, and actually we have been taking the last 4 months to try to consolidate the ROF programme, and we're very, very clear. We have 4 big key priorities. The digital solution that you're talking about is a huge priority for us. This food standards work is a massive priority. The National Inspection Strategy work is the 3rd priority, and then we have our meat modernisation programme. Now, of course, there are a number of dependencies that sit around that. So, for example, our approach to sampling, the work that we're doing on surveillance and our capability there, the NFCU expansion and capability, and also then we have to be very cognizant of the allergen work as well. Now, that creates difficulties for us in terms of our prioritisation, but we're very, very clear on our ROF priorities, and I think that will really help us as we go into the what is really phase 2 of delivery in terms of some of these key priorities. I think we're quite clear on where we want to go. The difficulty that we have is that, you know, we have a really key delivery partnerships with our local authorities, and that's where the real pressure is, and that's why we need to work with them and bring them along with us and allow ourselves to understand where their pressure points are and what we need to do to help them.
If I could just pick up, Dave, on your comment around pace being pedestrian. One of the difficulties is that today you're getting an update in relation to food standards. The current thinking is that in September the board will get an update across the priorities that Maria has just covered. And one thing I would like to reassure you is that it is not pedestrian. In terms of the register a food business digital service, whilst we did the alpha phase of that with 11 local authorities across England, Wales and Northern Ireland, testing it, helping us refine it, fill some gaps in the minimum viable product. We now have developed an approach that local authorities will be able to use the new digital service without full integration with their back office system. The level of interest in that is fantastic. We had 140 local authorities who immediately put their hands up and said, we're interested. And we wrote out to them this week to try and get a plan in place to sequence bringing them on. So I'm confident that over the next 6 months, you will see significant improvement in implementation.
Mary.
Well, just a comment really, an acknowledgement of this sense, as Jason was saying, of sort of a guiding mind moving towards the recreation of the food system. I mean, I guess from the sort of relative outside, even sitting as a board member, you see the individual strands of work, but you know, I feel I'm beginning to grasp this whole sort of, you know, we are seeing the future and we're moving ourselves towards that step by step by step, even though it feels like we're only seeing, you know, individual steps which look pedestrian, but actually really, I just want to acknowledge the agency for taking that sort of creative view.
Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I know I mentioned the complexity being more than the complexity in the paper, and I'm reassured by the answer and the way the answers have come forward. And just to provide some additional reassurance, I walked back to the hotel with Dave, and he walks really quickly. So.
Anything else? I mean, Richard, I think you've got lots of rich comment on that. But what I think we are definitely endorsing is the methodology, the care you're taking about how people are being brought into this, but also continuing to set that clear direction. And in complex programmes, there is always that point at which you seem to have every piece of the machine in motion. And we might just be getting to that point, and there is an element of just holding your nerve, and then you can start to slow some of those pieces down and speed them up again because you know how the new engine's going to work. And the final point I would say is I do really want us to put on record in the context of the National Audit Office report just how unusual it is for a department to receive a report which so clearly recognises the direction we've set and the steps that have been taken to achieve the objectives that we set out. So well done to the whole team on that outcome, and some really constructive recommendations from the NEO for us to pick up and follow up, particularly on the need for there to be a funding solution, which cannot only be in our hands. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Michael. Moving on now to consider the final report from the Science Council Working Group that's been looking at food system risks and horizon scanning. And John O'Brien, who many of us know, and is a member of the Science Council, is joining us at the table. He's led the working group that has produced this report for us. We've also got Rick Mumford, who has led on the executive response and the actions that we're going to take about it. Now, because the report's very long and everybody will have read it, I thought it was almost impossible to ask John to sort of try and introduce it in 3 minutes. So I thought what we might do is actually focus on questions so that we can get into the areas that board members particularly want to drill into straight away. So if that is okay, we'll open it up for any questions or observations that people want to contribute from around the table. And my first one was, when we look at all this report and how we're going to take it forward, I suppose, I know for John and for Rick and possibly for Guy together to think about, how are we going to get the assurance, we the board going to get the assurance, that we've embraced and are delivering this new ambition appropriately and adequately? It's great to know how to do it. We need to know that we are doing it and doing it right.
Starting?
Yes, go.
Okay.
Yeah.
In fact, it's something that came up. Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you, Madam Chair. We delved into the business of the governance of the process very early on in the Science Council, because we recognise the fact that the scanning process is quite easy. The challenge lies, A, in understanding what signals mean, and B, in follow-up, and then C, the quality assurance of the process. Is my horizon scanning working? So I think reading both the recommendations, we place a lot of emphasis in the follow-up review process and in the governance, the ownership, the process of checking that the system is working. But I think, handing over to Rick, the FSA executive response, I think, comprehensively also addresses our recommendations about governance and fact-checking.
Yeah, so thank you, John. I mean, in terms of what we need to do now is taking the report is to build it into a coherent horizon scanning capability that works right the way across the agency. I think one of the key things for me is how we make sure that this is embraced by the whole of the FSA, and this isn't just something that we have a team of a few people sat in a corner who do horizon scanning. It's actually something that we all need to do, and it actually needs to be part of it needs to be a key component of what I see as a wider surveillance system. So, you know, Michael alluded to earlier about this whole piece around intelligence. There's a whole range of different components that feed into this surveillance system, and it's how we then we build horizon scanning into that as maybe the longer terms, the 5-year, the 10-year kind of timescale on things. Maybe if you think about intelligence, maybe that's more immediate kind of surveillance work, and it's how we get the coherence across. Yes, we will put resources into it. You know, the Directorate will own this. We will provide a secretariat, if you like, a horizon scanning facilitation function. But I think it's incumbent on everyone and all the moving parts in the agency to feed into it.
Thank you. I've got Ruth, but did you want to come on that point? Ruth, please, Chair.
Oh, thank you. I think horizon scanning has an art to it, and that's the very point. It's answering the so what question. So I was really pleased to see that you have put some emphasis on what are you going to do with this work that as it emerges. I think the other issue as part of the so what is so when. When do you intervene? When do you recognise the signals are strong enough now to do something? And I suppose just to encourage a realisation that where some things may be 5-10 years out, suddenly something happens that catapults that issue. I'm thinking of things like plastics at the moment, you know, catapults it into, actually, we need to speed that up a bit. So I think encouragement to think long term, but also be flexible in terms of being able to spot where the signals are changing quite quickly. So really welcome the report and the approach to governance. Just on the specifics that have been looked at, I suppose a couple of areas, animal feed, seafood, how we scope the breadth of what's being looked at as well, and just a couple of areas maybe that you might want to consider. And then the third point, welcome the engagement with the science community, and just to say I really appreciate that the proposed symposium in Wales later this year, an ESRC symposium, bringing in the Welsh scientists into that debate, and just to make sure we've got a real spread of engagement across the nations. And then finally, again, from a Welsh perspective, in interpreting what we need to do, clearly the Wellbeing of Future Generations legislation is about thinking long term, is about thinking about the consequences for the next generation. So when we think about the so what, making sure that we're actually looking at the so what for now, but also so what for the next generation, the future long-term issues that would arise from the things that are emerging from the horizon scanning. So just a few areas to consider as this approach develops, but really well done, and I hope to see the fruits of it develop over the next few months and years.
Thank you. I think Guy might have wanted to come in on that, but there's also Stuart.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I worry about talking about pace now with Dave in the room, but I think one of the things which has been raised before is a crucial thing, I think, in terms of horizon scanning, in the same way as with the surveillance, is once it becomes an organisational feature rather than something which scientists do, you do get the pace that's required, and it's all part of the kind of the rest of the organisation knowing what it can offer, and then the people doing it knowing what they need to offer. So I think that makes a big difference. One of the really, I think, important parts that came out of the kind of the work that we did was the power of this workshop we held with numerous stakeholders, in which people were kind of asked almost to raise what they thought were the top 5 issues at that time, and the thought of doing that every year, which to me is pace, but some people might not think is pace, did enable a kind of a constant watch in terms of what was going down in terms of priority and what was perhaps coming up in terms of priority, which was quite useful. And another aspect of that which could be useful, and you mentioned horizon scanning being an art, in which it is something that we asked each of the scientific advisory committees to do on a regular basis, but without a prescription on terms of how they should do it, which I think meant it was done in kind of quite often different ways with different sort of time frames and that type of thing. Whereas, one of the things we're kind of recommending here is actually by having this sort of, here's the top 5 issues which came up from the previous year, are they the same this year, or are the things coming and going, gives a little bit more structure to each of the committees who then might participate in the day too. So hopefully it's illustrating bringing together shall we say, a more formalised process of how we go about it.
Thank you for that, Guy. I mean, I think it's a wonderful paper, my area, right up my alley, absolutely fantastic. One of the questions I have, though, is, horizon scanning, somebody said is the easy bit, because you can see the horizon. Have we ever spent much time looking beyond the horizon? Because some of the things that catch us out are the things that we never even thought of. So the scenario, the foresighting, has that been a big part of the consideration? I mean, I recognise where the focus is, but maybe it's beyond the remit. I don't know.
No, foresight is very much part of it. I think we had to find a sweet spot between the short term and the very long term, which would be quite impractical in terms of action. So the 5 to 10 years is what we came up with, both within the group and also, I think, with the recommendation from the RAND report. The discussion paper went a lot into foresight and the actual emerging new technologies. So we're recommending that one of the activities to underpin this will be keeping an eye on new technologies in terms of risks that might be presented, but also new technologies in terms of opportunities. And to echo the last paper, the last discussion, I think, the word static certainly does not apply to this. It's got to be a dynamic process. We can visualize, a set of issues that could be tracked. We can visualize the use of the Strategic Evidence Fund to deep dive into topics that require further investigation to improve understanding. We can then visualize some appropriate action that might be taken once that understanding is actually advocating appropriate action. So I think foresight, to answer your question, is very much part of this, and it's dynamic. To echo what Guy said, we were absolutely delighted with the efficacy of the process of engaging with the experts, both industry, learned societies, the SACs, the whole community of science. And I think in one day in September last year, we produced a deep mine of valuable information in terms of insights. So it's all about expertise, it's all about insights.
Julie.
Thank you. Yes, maybe in answer to part of Stuart's question, I think within the strategic surveillance programme, we are already moving more into the unknown unknowns territory and exploring what we might find in there. So I think that's something that we're already trying to do. And the second is, and maybe I'm speaking for the whole of the exec, we have accepted, I think, that one of the things that we need to be better at going forward is that inherent flexibility. So I think what maybe you're talking about is in part looking over the horizon, but also trying to identify those black swans. And I think that, again, is a capability that we need to have across the whole of the organisation. But I think just recognising it is step one.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, part of that as well is how we're going to not work in isolation on this. A lot of the things that we're talking about and those big trends, if you think about technology trends, it's not just not just something that's going to impact on the FSA. It's going to impact across government, across the society. So we also need to work with others, and part of that is how we engage with others, and we are doing that, looking at how other government departments do their horizon scanning. I'm quite happy to steal from others.
And the other thing is, when we originally commissioned the RAND organisation to do their work, it was very much in the foresight space actually, and we kind of demonstrated how kind of if you view things as a sort of a line, you have foresight here which talks to horizon scanning, which then talks to surveillance. So it's a kind of making sure that these things are joined up so that surveillance is a constant evolution informed by horizon scanning, and then foresight, does detect, the black swans, etc., as they come along. I mean, the one thing that I'd like to flag, which I'm not sure whether it was a surprise or not, but and the conversation we're having here, we often talk about horizon scanning or foresight to do with technology, but what becomes very obvious is some of the biggest disruption is social. And so if you take like the plastics issue, I mean, it's really a social phenomenon that drove it at speed and not a technological one. So I think, again, that a lesson learned from our organisation is that quite often when you do these types of exercises, we really focus in on changing in technology and industry kind of drivers, etc. And we perhaps don't always pay enough attention to the consumer suddenly doing something which creates a pace of change that technology can hardly keep up with.
Mary.
Really welcome the review. I've just the sort of question that emerged as I read the paper was just ensuring that we're not only fighting the last war, but also having a look at what's coming over the horizon and whether we need to create a mechanism where 5 years out we look back and said what we thought was going to happen 5 years ago, so that we can at least review whether our processes to do with foresight are appropriate.
Thank you. I've got Coleman, and I'm going to come back to John.
Chair, thank you. John, thank you very much for the paper. Really, really welcome paper, really good paper and a good response from the executive as to how we're going to put it in place. Just a couple of points for me, and it's really about the engagement with industry, because obviously there's a huge vested interest in industry in horizon scanning with big business, but obviously there's commercial sensitivity, so just curious as to how open and engaging they have been. And also in terms of looking at, speaking to Stuart's point on the broader foresight stuff, a lot of really good work being done in Ireland, North and South, you know, and I just wonder if you've had an opportunity to look at what's going on in the likes of AFBI and Queen's and Teagasc in the Irish Republic, who have a 2050 foresight strategy, so there's some really good stuff there.
I want to just add on to that, John, and pick up that comment about the engagement, and you talked about the quality of minds who've been willing to participate in this work. Science Council is a great starting point for it. And it always seems to me that if you're going to invite busy, eminent people to participate in something, they participate much more if they think action will be taken. So I'm interested in, do they think we do act anyway? And how do we make sure that they get visibility of the action that we take so they continue to want to engage? So it's a bit of a kind of carry forward from Colm's point.
In the context of engagement, we speak a little bit about buy-in in the report, and we're primarily focused at FSA and LA staff and others, but it also applies to all stakeholders. So I think we had an impressive level of engagement in the workshop, but I totally agree there has to be a closed loop here, whereby one goes back with, I guess, an expression of value added from the process, ultimately. And that's quite challenging here, because remember that if horizon scanning is working, signals disappear in principle, and so how do you explain why a signal is no longer there? So there is a retrospective analysis needed, I think, to explain what worked and what did not work for the benefit of all of the stakeholders. And I think in terms of the other point we made about availing of external sources, it's not something FSA should do by itself. Of course, I think the documents that we have are among the best I've seen in this area in terms of planning for an effective horizon scanning process. But I think there are other activities ongoing in parallel which FSA can tap into effectively by asking the right questions. I think what made the workshop effective was the questions were very carefully thought out. The boundaries for the discussion were defined in advance, although we have to be aware that sometimes it will drift and you have to allow enough flexibility. But having said that, I think if we can depend upon that level of engagement and interest and curiosity in the future, FSA will have a brilliant system for horizon scanning.
Thank you very much. Anything else on this? We have, I think, for Rick.
I'd just like to just finally say before we wrap up, I'd really like to thank John and the team at the Science Council for the work they've done on this. It was above and beyond the call of duty, so thank you very much, John.
Well, you stole my thunder, because when we thought of what we really wanted to challenge the Science Council with to start with, so oh yeah, let's toss this one to them. How hard can it be? So It has been difficult, we know. It is the holy grail, and we do really appreciate both the level of confidence you've given us and knowing that we were by no means starting in a bad place, but you've added real value. And I hope you will take away back to the council our determination that now we have this, we will be following through on it, because for everything you've heard, these are the things that should be occupying the board's mind much more, and we want to be in that space. So, John, very much appreciated, and thank you for coming to Birmingham to be with us today. Thank you.
My pleasure.
We will move on to animal feed. Mark is going to join us at the table. So, a timely update on our progress and position on delivering official controls on animal feed. Mark, would you like to give us an introduction?
Thank you very much. Yes, a welcome opportunity to update the board on arrangements for delivery of feed law official controls in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And that recognises really the significant changes and improvements that have been made in recent years. Feed hasn't been a core part of the ROF programme, and that recognises really the work that was already underway in this sector. But what I would like to say is that many of the changes we've introduced have been in line with the ROF programme, and in the paper we've set out where we see that alignment. Probably goes without saying, but feed's a vitally important part of the UK system of safe food production, and we know from the experience of incidents like BSE and foot and mouth the drastic and long-lasting consequences there can be from breakdowns in controls. It's unfortunate there, I think, that audits then by the European Commission in 2009 and 2011 identified what were significant failings with the UK system of controls for animal feed. And really the issues identified required a fundamental overhaul of the approach that we take to deliver a properly resourced and effectively targeted control system. The degree of change that was required varied between England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and that reflected the variation in approaches between the three countries that were already in place to enable a streamlined regulatory system. So in Northern Ireland, there's a single body responsible for delivery of feed controls, and that's the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, DERA, whereas in England and Wales, the controls are delivered by a large number of local authorities. I'd like to note at that point that whilst there is a variation in the delivery models in each country, they're actually underpinned by a common framework and set of key documents and processes to provide for consistency. And again, that's outlined in the paper. So following the Commission's audits, responsibility for the budget for feed official controls in England and Wales was brought into the agency. And that was to enable us to ensure a dedicated funding for this work based on a centrally coordinated programme of inspection, sampling and point of entry checks by local authorities. And again, that was already in place in Northern Ireland because the funding was through DERA. In Wales, the programme is managed by FSA officials, whereas in England it's managed jointly by ourselves and an organisation called National Trading Standards. And we have a memorandum of understanding for that arrangement. And that reflects really the greater number of local authorities involved in England. And what I would say is that the support of NTS over the last few years in the change of approach we've taken has really been integral in ensuring that we could effectively deliver. We've made fundamental changes to the Feed Law Code of Practice and the equivalent guidance in Northern Ireland as the key mechanism through which we give direction on the delivery of controls. And most significantly within that, the risk assessment process has been modernised to ensure resources are targeted at businesses posing the greatest risk. That includes the introduction of a formal process for recognition of feed business membership of an industry assurance scheme, where that scheme has been approved by the agency following an assessment against established criteria. And in these circumstances, that then allows for a minimum frequency of official controls, a sort of a reduction, in the minimum to be hardwired into the risk assessment process, recognising their membership of the scheme. And again, about focusing resources where they're most needed. Importantly, I'd say that approach is designed to supplement and not replace official controls, and local authorities or DERA still retain the right to carry out enforcement action or inspections within any feed business, whether they're a member scheme or not, whenever they consider appropriate. Our approach to formal recognition of industry assurance was the subject of a fact-finding visit by the European Commission in 2016 and subsequently cited as good practice. There was lots of positive feedback from that visit, and the example of what we'd done was shared with other member states. And actually, the work we've done in this sector has also formed part of the UK's evidence base for informing codex discussions on looking at third-party assurance in the broader context. We've also introduced a more intelligence-led approach to feed controls, underpinned by annual national enforcement priorities that we set that give direction to local authorities and DERA on the perceived areas of greatest risk. Those priorities are developed collaboratively with colleagues and external partners, DERA, NTS, local authorities, public analysts, and more recently they've also been informed by a feed threat assessment that we carry out every 2 years with colleagues in the National Food Crime Unit to identify the current and emerging risks to the integrity of the feed chain. So we try and make sure those priorities are forward-looking in terms of the risks. In England, a comprehensive review of the arrangements was carried out in 2016. That was to enable us to assess whether we were in the right direction with the changes we'd introduced, given the scale of changes that there were. And I'm pleased to say that the outcome of that review was broadly positive, acknowledging the improvements that have been achieved, particularly in relation to things like value for money, the engagement levels with local authorities, delivery of a risk-based programme. But it also made a number of recommendations about how we could improve the system further, and we've used those to inform the development now of a 4-year strategy in England to ensure we continue to improve. And colleagues in Wales are planning to deliver a similar review this year, reflecting the fact that they were slightly slower than us in introducing the changes. The European Commission have also followed up on their 2009 and 2011 audits, including a further audit in 2014 and subsequent monitoring of our actions. And again, pleased to say that there's been positive reflection on the improvements made and the system we now have in place. Just wanted to finish by saying, whilst we recognise the improvements since 2014, I think it is important to note back the significant shortcomings in the system prior to that and the scale of the challenge we've faced. Our focus over the last 5 years really has been on establishing what we view to be a robust framework for risk-based targeting of controls, ensuring the integrity of the data that we get from local authorities, and also looking at improving business compliance. And that includes, in the last year or so, releasing some funding to enable follow-up activity to be carried out at the least compliant businesses. And whilst we're confident we've gone a long way to achieving what we set out at that stage, we are keen to continue to build on the improvements. And we're looking at the moment, we've just begun some work to assess compliance in businesses in a bit more detail, to look at the impact of our controls on business compliance and animal and public health outcomes. And we'll be using the outcomes of that work to further refine the risk assessment process. Thank you very much. Look forward to comments and questions.
Mark, thank you very much, both for a comprehensive paper and for setting out the progress so clearly there. And I think we would all want to recognise just the distance that's been travelled with feed. I know all the board members always remember, why does the FSA exist? It exists significantly because of something called BSE and the lack of oversight and awareness of the risks that can be caused by feed contamination, terrible risk to public health, and also huge and far-reaching consequences for the economy and for trade. So thankfully, we're in a position now where incidents in feed are few and far between. And I think you've set out really clearly some of the actions that have been taken to help us achieve that position. One of the consequences of being a success is you don't get much time with the board. So it's very nice to have you here. I had, I think, Colm and Ruth and Stuart, everybody. We'll start with Colm.
Chair, thank you. I think we had the opportunity at NIFAC to discuss this back in March, April time, and had a fairly detailed discussion on it. As you say, DERA are the competent authority for feed regulation in Northern Ireland, and doing an extremely good job working very closely with the Food Standards Agency. And there are a lot of good learnings to be had from there, particularly around the Food Fortress. And I think some board members previously had the opportunity to look at that in action across Northern Ireland. So it's the extent to which we can actually take those learnings and the earned recognition within that scheme that works very well for the industry. The one thing that we discussed this on Monday in Northern Ireland that we felt there could have been a bit more in the paper was around EU exit, and I know that has gone away temporarily, but it hasn't gone away permanently, and we do need to understand the issues that could be affected were that to come back on us again in October, as is likely. So how ready are we for EU exit and the implications for that? Bear in mind, Northern Ireland is a particularly difficult area. We have more livestock per hectare in Northern Ireland than any other part of the UK, so it is a huge issue for us. So in terms of EU exit, just interested in what provisions are in place.
Going to come back on that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yes, you're right. As you say, slightly gone away, but I think a lot of the work obviously was being done in readiness for the end of March. So we were already having lots of discussions around making sure that we was in the best place possible to prepare for that. I think the good thing for me in terms of thinking about the recognition of the system we've got in place is the fact that we've had that endorsement from the Commission on the approach that we've taken and the system we've got. So we feel we're in a good place to sort of justify the situation that we have. There are some idiosyncrasies, for want of a better word, in terms of being in and out of the club when it comes to feed. And again, we've done the best we can in terms of being prepared for those for whenever we do leave the EU.
Mary and then Stuart.
Really slightly following on from that comment of comms in the EU exit space in part, but also in part because our feed system relies on a lot of imported feeds from right around the world, not just the EU. Lots of those are often byproducts of the human food chain. What are the sort of, in terms of earned recognition, how do we manage the inspection and auditing of those feeds coming in? I mean, thinking of, there was the lead-in feed sometime back in the 90s, wasn't there? How do we see that going forward? Have we got that right now in terms of our inspection and auditing, and what does that look like in any likely future under EU exit?
I mean, through the arrangements that we've got in place, we're fortunate in the feed sector in that we have relatively few industry assurance schemes that represent large proportions of the industry, and through the Agricultural Industries Confederation, and they actually have 3 schemes that they run that we've approved. Actually, we're already sort of picking up the significant element of feed, whether that's produced in the UK or coming in from elsewhere. And then obviously the local authority controls that supplement that as well. And I think what I would say is that we feel that we've got a strong system in place in terms of the assurances that we get from the approved assurance schemes, both in terms of the assessment we carry out before we grant approval, but then the ongoing monitoring, conversations and quality checking that we do to make sure that they continue to fulfil the requirements that we set.
Stuart.
Thank you. Another excellent paper. It's funny how it brings together actually several strands of the business we've talked about so far this morning. We've talked about the complexity of regulation. We've talked a little bit about the kind of foresighting issues, and go back to the BSE case. Even with foresighting, would we have picked up BSE ahead of when it arrived? Probably not. Who knows? My concern is if I'm looking at Annex 4, and if I've done my calculations right, you've got about 140,000 establishments in England and Wales, with the desktop exercise suggesting that the planned inspections would be about 1% of that. Does that, well, A, it's a lot of inspections anyway, and B, does that really provide the assurance that we would need to address the potential risks that are out there? I know it's a risk-based exercise, but we're dependent upon delivery partners. There's a lot of work here, and it's 1% of the total number of establishments. Is that going to do the job?
Yeah, recognise that. I mean, I think that the large sort of proportion of the businesses within the sector are farms. What we've tried to do in that space is look at the fact that, and this is part of a separate piece of work that DEFRA have been taking forward, looking at trying to recognise the number of different regulatory functions that operate on farm and how you can have better coordination between them. And as part of both the feed threat assessment and our national enforcement priorities, we try and look at information that's coming from other regulators that are present in these locations to see where we can draw on that in terms of targeting, to make sure that whilst we're only able to inspect a relatively small number, what we're doing is we're targeting our activity in the right places, picking up on where there's already a strong presence.
Guy, I think you might want to come in on that.
Yes, I just wondered in that sense whether using kind of historic incidents, you could do some sort of sensitivity analysis to do with proxy factors or whichever, which would enable you to say, monitoring X would give us a 90% chance of picking up something which would, be harder to do through other means. And I just wondered, there must be some incidents which are big enough or interesting enough to kind of take that approach.
That sounds good. I mean, I think it'd be good if we could have a conversation about that and look into it.
It is an important point, though, about the number of the 140,000, but about 110,000 of those are farms. It's a significant number which fall into quite a different sort of category, really, but still need to be overseen. Yeah, Ruth. Sorry.
So I was just going to come in quickly on that, and just to say as well that in the context of farms there, such a wide variation in terms of both the size, the scale, the nature of the operation and what have you. So it's a very kind of broad sort of cross-section within that.
Thank you. My point sort of follows on from that, because I was exactly in the same area as Stuart was, in terms of trying to understand the impact of the choices that are being made about earned recognition or tabletop exercises. And the way to do that is to focus on outcomes. And I was pleased to hear that you're doing some work about outcomes, both in business compliance and also public health outcomes. As a board, I think that's where we need to be assured. Not that just the inspections are happening, and really pleased the progress and improvements that are being made in terms of the inputs into that process. But we really need to be clear now, what impact are we having? Are we actually seeing improvements? And when you mentioned you were developing work on outcomes, when do you anticipate we'd be in a position to have reports on those outcomes?
We are having conversations at the moment, actually, with analytical colleagues about sort of the process and the data that we now have available to us to start making those assessments. I anticipate we'll start to look at that, or start to see some of the fruit of that in the autumn. So potentially then we'd be looking to be able to report on it sort of later in the year or early next year. I think I think at this stage, as I say, it has very much been a staged approach, and it's now that we're seeing the data that we're able to really try and get underneath it a bit more in terms of understanding the picture. But certainly, yeah, I would hope that we'll be in a position to update soon.
Steve wants to come in on that.
Thanks. And a point more generally, in the paper it asks the board to recognise the work underway to assess the alignment of the approaches for animal feed to ROF principles. And just, I suppose, to stress that this isn't because in any way our approaches to animal feed are behind the curve. In many ways they've been at the vanguard and were early demonstrators of the way these principles can be applied through the use of data to reduce and target inspections, the use of compliance data from other sectors, as Guy said, as proxies, and now trying to build that story about impact and the link of the change in inspection profile to outcomes in terms of compliance and public health. All of those are things that we are doing first in animal feed, and just to focus on the use of data from third-party assurance schemes and the extent to which, through ensuring the robustness and governance of data from those schemes, it can be used with confidence for regulatory decision making, and that's the model we're looking to apply more generally, and a model that has interest not just across other sectors of control and regulation in the UK, but more internationally. And the UK has been leading the work in Codex that was referred to, that we hope will result in some agreed draft guidelines when the Codex Commission meets next month. We were invited to give evidence to a US public hearing when they were designing controls related to their Food Safety Modernisation Act, which has influenced their thinking. And there are some new frontiers here for us to explore as well in terms of imports and how we apply that approach to valuing robust and well-governed data, not just when it's made available to us from UK producers, but from overseas producers as well, and the way in which we can use those same approaches to better understand the safety and need for controls in relation to imports, particularly for the UK in the future. So I think that there's much here that we can apply more widely.
I'm really glad you said that, because I think for me, particularly given some of the other discussion we've had this morning, what you have described to us is a proof point of our ability to recognise something's not working, recognise it works or doesn't work differently in 3 countries, apply some consistent central principles, and work through a whole programme of change to give us a better model that absolutely is aligned with where we're going on broader regulatory reform. So notwithstanding all the things you've identified about what you want to do next, which I think the board would entirely endorse, and picking up that point about the impacts, and as soon as we are able to look at that, it's really positive. It shows us acting as a central competent authority. There's absolutely no doubt that that's the role that we've taken here. We're accommodating devolution in an entirely appropriate way, and we're applying, Steve's word, we're in the vanguard with this about how we're approaching ROF. So I think it's got a lot for us to be very thankful for and welcome, but also to translate into other areas as well. And we'll look at those impact data when it comes back and see what other lessons we can learn from that. So thank you very much indeed, Mark, for being here and presenting that. We will now break and reconvene at 11 o'clock. We're moving on now, second half of the meeting, to talk about sampling. Rick is back to take us through this a really important issue that we've wanted back on the board agenda, to now pick up where we are after we've done the intense focus on building our surveillance capability at the national level, to get back into now looking at our strategic approach to sampling. So Rick, over to you.
Thanks, Heather. So what I'm not going to do is go through the report in detail, because obviously you've all had it, and I assume you can all read. So it's there to it's there for you to comment on. But I thought what I'd make is 3 key points about the sampling strategy as it's presented to you. And the first point, I think, is about that this is very much a distillation of what is a very, very complicated situation and picture. So that's not only in terms of the number of moving parts within the agency itself, but obviously the interactions outside. So with the local authorities piece, and I think we've got some of the earlier papers alluded to some of the complexity and how sampling fits into that, with both feed and also regulating our future. But of course, we mustn't underestimate the interaction across the 3 different countries as well, and the variation in situation between England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and how that all interplays. So again, while this is a very simple sort of helicopter view, if you like, of sampling, it shouldn't mask the complexity that is working beneath the surface. I think my second key point as well is that this is a synthesis of a lot of work that's already been done and is ongoing. So there's lots of wheels in motion already. I pick up on just an example. As one of the annexes, we talk about the multi-annual national control plan. Again, a new one has just been published, a very excellent comprehensive piece of work. And again, that shows the sort of level of work that's going into this whole sort of dynamic piece around sampling. And I guess my final key point is one that we raised earlier as well under the horizon scanning piece. This isn't, sampling isn't alone. It doesn't stand alone. It's not a means to an end in itself. it must be seen in the context of wider surveillance program or a system. Again, you know, we've talked about all the work earlier. We've talked about the work we're doing on horizon scanning. There's the strategic surveillance work that Julia and the team are leading on. So there's a whole range of other pieces in there. And how do we actually plug sampling into that and make sure that it's part of an integrated surveillance system? So ultimately, the ask is as presented. You know, we've presented, you know, with some background, recognising maybe the weaknesses in some of the sort of previous places we've been, but also the ongoing work that's being done. What is our rationale for sampling? What are the guiding principles that we might use for developing new sampling programmes? And then ask the board to review that and endorse our plans for implementation of this over the next year. And I'll leave it there and take questions.
Thank you very much. Who would like to begin? Dave.
Someone's got to. Thanks for this, Rick. Very useful paper as always. I guess my question is really linked in the first part to what Ruth was talking about earlier on the animal feed side of things. And we talk here about the implementation phase, we talk here about the review phase. What does good look like? What outcomes are we expecting to get from, what outcomes are we looking for that will tell us our sampling strategy is effective? Because I suppose one thing that we have been fortunate enough on is that even though we've had reduced sampling over the last couple of years, our public health outcomes don't appear to have deteriorated. Given the, I suppose, influx of allergen recalls, for instance, that's probably driven the increase in numbers. So what would success look like when we're reviewing this? And the second part, lots of sampling activity happens out in industry and amongst other partners. So how are we able to share information on a safe basis with them to also use their sampling activity to inform ours?
Yeah, I mean, to answer the second piece first, I mean, that is absolutely essential. And I think the point here about the strategy is that we are trying to cover a lot of areas that aren't necessarily in our direct control. So there are areas where we obviously want to influence and we obviously want to steer and where possible set the direction and show some leadership. But ultimately, it does come down to the fact that, as you say, a lot of this work is being done in industry, and how do we capture that? So again, there's a big piece of work to be done about data sharing and how we can integrate on that. I think in the other piece, I guess it's a very good question about what does good look like, and the key part is how we then introduce reviews. So when are we ultimately doing, if we set up a program of sampling, are we actually doing that lessons learned at the end of it and then putting feedback into the loop? It was alluded to the other day about how sometimes when we present things, they tend to look very linear as a single sort of pipeline or process, but actually most of these things are a circular loop, and we have to learn lessons and identify the gaps and feed it back. So.
Julie.
And if I may build on the points Rick's making there about demonstrating the value of sampling, I would also suggest that sampling isn't an end in itself and should be considered within that wider surveillance programme. And I think that's something that we need to evolve.
Steve wants to come in and Guy, but Dave, did you want to follow up on that? No, Steve and then Guy.
I think it's this point, precisely as Julie says. What does good look like? I think we need to recognise that sampling in itself doesn't drive public health outcomes. It needs to be an integrated part of the system. So in order to understand what good looks like for sampling, I think you need to look at the system and ask how sampling is integrated with other sampling data from others, integrated into a system as we've tried to set out in the body of paper through intelligence to hypothesis testing to official controls. So integration, also focus. Does do sampling strategies that meet this model allow us to identify and focus in on and resolve issues? So I think those are the questions that I would ask if I was trying to demonstrate whether our sampling approach is good. But I think just the key question is that on its own, it won't drive public health outcomes.
I'm going to come back to Guy. I just want to say something on that, though. I think one of the things that we observed just didn't happen with the very flawed national sampling approach that used to exist. I mean, the sampling wasn't done consistently at the local level. It wasn't fed in consistently. It was fed to something that was imperfect. And then also, there seemed to be a lack of understanding that somewhere someone has to be accountable for doing something with it, for looking at it, recognising something, and then doing something about it. And so I think there's another, we talked a lot about cross-department sort of activity today. It's another bit of everybody understanding that there is a responsibility and it needs to sit in places to act on what signals we see and collect. Guy.
As Steve flagged in terms of these three areas of our business, whether it be to do with a source of intelligence data which can interact with the surveillance or testing specific hypotheses or parts of the official controls. Success might look slightly different for each of those, but you can potentially look at the success of those. So in terms of success for the intelligent data, etc., the good interaction with surveillance, so that effectively surveillance flagging something and then sampling to show, yes, it's real, or it's not real, or we're picking up something that the surveillance isn't. Why is that? It's a kind of an area that you can look at. I think the really, the first place to potentially start is the area which I think we used very well in the sort of the fipronil incident. If that, on that sampling perspective, which was the question of, is fipronil in the British egg supply system? A sampling strategy was developed to look at British eggs and whether we could confidently say fipronil was present in them like it was in the Dutch eggs. And that was based on how many eggs would you need to sample to be 90% sure of seeing the same level of pesticide that was seen elsewhere, and that would take 2 or 3 weeks of laboratories to do, and it turned out that that was an accurate way forward, which again is a measure of success. So I think in that sort of sampling, the area of kind of building how certain you would be of detecting various things by sampling at this kind of frequency or in this approach, it is a system that you could build in advance and check retrospectively as to, was our level of confidence appropriate in that. So I think success looks different according to these different types of sampling. What success doesn't look like is just sampling, doing nothing with the data and feeling confident because you've been doing it.
Mary.
So really welcome this paper. I mean, it certainly reflects the way that things look like in industry, where sampling, as we've said, used to be a sort of single endpoint of assurance to or sort of quality control, as opposed to quality assurance, where you're looking at it validating your risk assessments, validating your HACCPs, and it almost feels like it feeds into the whole ROF program of risk and recognition. It feels like it's sort of in that whole sphere, so that we can be validating, as we say, what we're doing, rather than testing and thinking we're doing a good job but not. Thanks.
Thank you. Stuart.
Thank you. Really just to emphasise the good, I think, does look different in different contexts. I mean, if we're trying to establish a prevalence, that's a very different sampling strategy to freedom from. And re-emphasising the fact that sampling is a tool and not the end in itself, I think, is also important. So the surveillance or monitoring with intent of action is the bit, not the sampling itself. And the only thing I would say is whilst we have to be efficient and maximise the utility of our sampling, the sample ones test many. We've just got to be a little bit careful on that one, I think, because if we've set up something for one purpose, it may not be fit for another purpose, and we just got to be sure we don't convince ourselves otherwise.
Yeah, and I think we need to make sure that's an aspiration, but not necessarily a coverall approach. Yeah.
Thank you. Really welcome the paper and the sense of taking a strategic overview of the whole approach, maximising the use of data and the outputs from sampling. I think just one thing that I wanted to I suppose be careful about in terms of implementation is that at the moment I understand there's quite a lot of local engagement about agreeing sampling strategies. I know in Wales there's an involvement with local authorities, there's a sum of money set aside and there's an agreed programme there. Now, I just think as we set out the strategic framework, it would be important to set out the decision-making points and the levels of authority, if you like. That may not be the right word, but who decides would be part of that implementation approach and for what purpose. But I absolutely agree the need to pool all that information, make maximum use of it, but just make sure that we engage frontline in that process. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's absolutely recognised. I think it's incredibly important to recognise that there is some good practice in this area as well, and it's not to in any way assume that everything is not being done effectively. And again, a lot of that, and it has been echoed by many colleagues that they've talked about this, have really emphasised the differences between approaches in different places and how some areas have worked very well. So yeah, we are very cognizant of that.
Can I just check though? That's not our money being given to local authorities for sampling, because we don't do that in England anymore, do we?
No.
Colleagues will correct me. My understanding is there is a sum of money which is spent in partnership with the local authorities, which is FSA Wales, I think.
The source of the money is from the Welsh government.
Yeah.
Right, okay. I probably would lift that out a bit. I'm just conscious that we hear a lot about the different resource positions of local authorities in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And every time I hear that, and then I discover that actually we've got a different approach to the level to which we ourselves resource them. I'm conscious that when in Wales, again, actually, authorities fell behind on their food safety inspections, we resource them to do it, but we don't do that in England. So perhaps that's a separate point we could come back to, just in terms of a consistent position about how we're dealing with that extra resource, not particularly on that issue per se.
No, just to pick up Julie's point, it's Welsh Government allocates the resource and it's available through the FSA. Yeah.
I just want to flag the issue to do with the industrial data, in which we're currently moving towards working with a network of industry and academia in the area of data trusts, which is ways in which data can be shared and with an element of trust, so people some of their concerns are addressed. And we hope to be in a position in the next couple of weeks to announce how that's happening. But I suppose I'd use this meeting for all industry that out there with data that would like to participate in that activity. Then they're very welcome to join in to help move that forward.
Very opportunistic, good mention. Anything else in terms of input to the direction that Rick's proposing on sampling? No, in that case, we're very happy to support it and crack on.
Thank you very much.
We're now moving on to our approach to regulatory enforcement and sanctions. We've got Alice and Chris joining us. And I think Alice is going to kick off.
Thank you. This paper sets out the role of the FSA in relation to regulatory enforcement and sanctions for food and feed. It describes the wider Westminster government context concerning criminal sanctions. Our goal is to have a suite of sanctions available to us and our delivery partners that are effective, proportionate and dissuasive. The NAO report of last week on food safety and standards included a recommendation about addressing gaps in our enforcement powers. We have identified some gaps in our research base on sanctions. Section 7 of the paper includes proposals for a work plan on sanctions, including research on sanction effectiveness and a review of our existing arrangements. It also includes a suggestion for an overhaul we could undertake if that research and review suggests it's warranted. Chris.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, board members. I just wanted to use the limited slot we've got to give an illustration of some of the issues in the paper by reference to a specific example. The FSA has recently expanded the way in which it uses regulatory sanctions in relation specifically in England to compliance with novel food. So the EU introduced a new novel food regulation in 2016, and we took the opportunity in providing for its domestic enforcement to move beyond the simple use of criminal sanctions for enforcement of that regulation. And actually, we provided in our domestic provisions in England for the use of stop notices, compliance notices, and fixed penalty notices. I think I need to say no more about what those involve. I think the clue's in the name, but it's very much a case of us moving in the direction that central government is advocating around, moving beyond the simple use of criminal sanctions, which is quite a blunt instrument in many respects for enforcement of food law and feed law. So we're certainly moving in the right direction. The paper speaks to some of that. Also, we I think, are responding in expanding our use of different types of sanctions to the calls, which are the clarion calls, which are being made by local authority enforcers to have a wider range of tools at their disposal. So very much a work in progress. We think we're making reasonable, taking reasonable steps towards achieving a wider range of sanction and use of sanctions in accordance with our aim to become an excellent, accountable, modern regulator. So, Alice.
Yes. So another complex area, and we invite the board's views on the existing situation and our proposed work plan.
Thank you very much, Alice and Chris. I just want to ensure that we understand as a board where we're positioned on this. It's our responsibility to make sure there's a full and effective suite of sanctions, that they support our regulatory ambition, that they help business comply and do the right thing, and that there's no constraint on our power to use them appropriately. But it's not for the board to decide what is the right sanction in any particular circumstance. Clearly, that is an operational and enforcement decision. So we are all in the same place and understanding that. Questions, observations? Colm.
Yeah, really welcome the paper. Thank you very much for that. And I think that we have, and we'll see later on in the business committee, the really positive use of sanctions in creating the right approach from businesses. And I agree with the chair. It's not for the board to say how to use the sanctions, but are we satisfied that we and our partners are using the sanctions available to us in the appropriate way to deliver the outcomes that we want to see as a regulator?
We've got no reason to think that the current application is not as we would wish it, but without doing the piece of work proposed in the paper, we can't say for certain.
I wanted to particularly pick up, I'm so interested in what you said about the novel food example, and we have some sanction tools there that we don't have or aren't available in other areas. And really, should we be building a faster body of evidence and the case for having similar kind of tools in other areas? You know, the paper talks about fixed RANs in certain areas. We've got those in some countries and not in others, etc. So is one of the things that you're aiming for the board actually to take a stronger line and completing the suite of sanctions that would help us deliver that appropriate balance between civil and criminal?
I think that's exactly right, Chair. Yes, the example we gave in relation to novel foods, the instrument only came into operation in March of 18, so we really don't have any sense yet of how well the new provisions are being used in that specific area. And part of what we're seeking the board's endorsement of is our ability to do some work to analyse, quite how well those specific provisions are being used, so that we can hopefully scale that up and extend it to other areas of specific food regulation.
And we will be getting evidence about how RANs work in different countries of the UK that are able to use them.
Yes.
Good. Anything else? Dave?
I suppose I'm slightly unclear, and so I'll just ask a couple of very quick questions to start with, if I can, before I make a point that may or may not need making, I suppose. Our current, we talk about a number of sanctions in our business committee report. Have they been laid under civil or criminal law when those significant fines have been made?
Dave, they're criminal sanctions.
Fine.
So we're only now moving into the sphere of using civil sanctions.
And if they were laid under civil law, obviously the balance of proof is less, but is also the sanction, like, is the severity of sanction less as well under civil law rather than criminal law?
That's a really good question, and probably not for today, because the issue around enabling powers is quite complex. The short answer is with civil sanctions, yes, you're absolutely right. The standard of proof is much less. We're not talking about beyond reasonable doubt. It's simply more likely than not that a failure in compliance has occurred, which is attractive from the point of view of a local authority's ability to enforce. But right now, the level of civil sanction that we've applied, again taking novel foods as an example, is quite low. And I think that needs to be revisited. It needs to be looked at in the sense of, is it driving behaviours? We need to take a view as to how far we can raise those levels of civil fine. It is quite sensitive. Obviously, it has an impact on business costs. So very much part of the review, which is kind of advocated in the paper.
Okay. And then, so linked to that, can you have the choice of whether you pursue a particular case either through civil or criminal, or do we have to kind of have one or the other as our regime? Because I kind of get the benefits of civil, however, it would kind of be it's useful as a deterrent to ensure that in the most severe cases, particularly where willful negligence can be demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt, that imprisonment could be the ultimate sanction.
Yes, absolutely. Our strong objective is to ensure that we retain the ability to use criminal sanctions straight away where the severity of an incident or non-compliance is such that that's warranted. And quite clearly, that we need to retain all of the dissuasive effects of criminal sanctions where need be. So our approach, certainly, I can speak for the approach to the legislative drafting. We've been very careful to ensure that freedom of choice remains, and that there's flexibility to respond to the circumstances as they emerge, because obviously every non-compliance has its own kind of unique features. So very much a preservation of that choice.
That was a really helpful explanation. Thank you. Well, I think this paper reflects some things that have come up in passing board discussions over the last 18 months or so. So it's really helpful to see it all drawn together here. And your proposal that we broaden that pool, that toolbox, make it a bit bigger, seems entirely sensible. And then I suppose the other thing the board will always ask is, how are we going to know whether it's been effective? We won't ask you that yet, because you've got to do the research to work that out first. So, but we will want some measures in the end about it. Ruth.
Just on that point, are we drawing from other regulators and the evidence of impact in parallel sectors? Will that be part of your research?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Excellent. If we're done on that, thank you very much for this paper. But I don't think, Chris, that you've been at the board for the last couple of years. And so I didn't want you not to go away without being able to say on behalf of the board how much we appreciate the work you've done on EU exit and your team. I know it's not just been a sole effort, but the heavy lifting you've done on our statutory instruments and a lot of the other components of EU exit have been really appreciated. So thank you very much indeed. And Alice, in a similar vein, on the NAO report, it's noted and very welcome. Thank you. Pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Chair.
We'll move on to reports from Colm and Ruth on their food advisory committees, to the extent that we've not already covered it. Ruth, would you like to begin?
Thank you, Chair. I think you've touched on it, really. The committee met in April to discuss animal feed, and you've seen an output from that discussion with the board papers, and it also met by Skype and teleconference to discuss the board papers, and my contributions have reflected some of the points that were raised there. Just to say, the next meeting is actually in a couple of weeks' time, and will be involving quite a wide range of stakeholders in discussing the strategy for the FSA in terms of key issues in Wales. So we'll be doing an exploration of the food system in Wales and any areas that we wish to highlight, and that'll be our next output.
Thank you. Colm, you can do your FAC first and then ARAC.
Okay. On the Food Advisory Committee, we're now sort of 6 months into the new arrangements for Food Advisory Committees and working very well. Since our last formal board meeting in March, we've met on 3 or 4 occasions to discuss particular areas around feed and feed controls in Northern Ireland, and indeed the issues around allergens. Both of those papers have been fed into the board. We also plan to meet in late July to look at strategy and how the strategy we're developing for FSA going forward will impact on what are the big particular issues for Northern Ireland, and again that will involve a wide range of stakeholders from the consumer groups and industry to look at that and other government departments. So it's working very well, and I think most members have benefited from seeing the copies of the papers as they've been fed through.
Thank you very much. And then the report from you as Chair of Audit and Risk Assurance.
Yeah, the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, the paper from our meeting of the 22nd of May is in the paper, and I will take that as read and happy to take any questions of that. Since then, we had a teleconference last week on the 11th of June to sign off on the accounts. We were able to recommend the sign-off to the accounting officer for the accounts for Northern Ireland and for Wales, and to recommend the sign-off on the Westminster and consolidated accounts, subject to CNAG approval. There is a small technical issue around a revaluation of a pension scheme affecting about 17 public sector bodies across, and it's really to do with the revaluation of assets. Grant Thornton are working on behalf of the National Audit Office to resolve that. Unfortunately, we would have ideally, it should have been resolved by now. It's been a bit more difficult than they had anticipated. Certainly, the Food Standards Agency, I expect, are one of the smaller partners in this, but they're still pressing to get it signed off by the end of June, but certainly they expect to have it signed off before Parliament rises on the 18th of July. So Jason will be ready to sign whenever we get that go ahead.
Thank you. Just to be clear, that's not a problem of our making. We're just a recipient of the problem.
Oh, no, absolutely not. I think in terms of the discussions last Tuesday on the teleconference, it was very clear there's been a very strong working relationship with the National Audit Office and Mazars who are supporting them. I think they're very complimentary about the work that the team have put in. It's a very clean audit, as we've come to expect. I think that's not in any way down to IRAC at all. That's down to the fantastic work and leadership of the team. And I think I should also reference we have been working closely with the executive and keeping involved with the National Audit Office report. And I echo your comment earlier that Jason and the entire team here, it's a fantastic result that we get, and it's seldom have I seen an endorsement from the National Audit Office on the work of a government department. And I think that's exactly what we call. So congratulations to all the team who achieved that.
Thank you. Anything that any board members not on ARAC, which is a vanishingly small number these days, would like to pick up or pursue there? No. Oh, well, that rather neatly brings me to the next paper, because, as we referenced at the start of the meeting, we're just in a little hiatus between board members having come to the ends of their term and the process of appointment being concluded for new board members. And just in case there are any delays, there's a level of movement in political leadership at the moment, as you may have noticed. So who knows whether that might cause any hiatus. We did feel it was important just to make some short-term adjustments to the quorum of the various the board and business committee requirements, so that there can be no doubt if we were in a position where we were still a little underweight on board members, there could be no question about the board or committee's ability to operate in line with its standing orders. So it's quite a long paper to make a very small number of adjustments for a short period of time, but important that we are happy to make those adjustments as set out in the paper, and then we will of course bring that back to the board to reinstate or make any other adjustment the board wants to make to those standing orders when the board's up to a bigger number again. So are you happy to accept the recommendations in that report? Thank you very much indeed. And that brings me on to the one item of any other business that I have, which is to mark Jason's departure from the FSA. Your last board meeting, Jason, 38 years in public service, 4.5 years with the FSA, 2 and a bit years as our chief executive. We welcomed you into the chief exec role with 3 major incidents in 6 months, because it's important to test somebody and see whether they're really up to the job. And we discovered you really were up to the job. So I think, what can I say? Not only did you deal with that and take end-to-end control of our preparation for EU exit, and commit when you tendered your resignation to retire that you would wait until the end of this month so that you'd seen us through EU exit. That is your one fail, to be honest. But nevertheless, we were ready. We were definitely ready for the 31st of March. But I think, aside from all those individual contributions you've made, it's a real mark of you as a public servant that you leave this department in so much better shape than you both arrived in it and took the control of it as chief executive. I think it's more confident. I think it's incredibly cohesive. I think its relationships with its stakeholders have continued to strengthen and widen and deliver real value for all of us. And I think I'm talking for the exec here, and the ability you have to make progress and deliver the right outcome from the public, and in terms of our ambition. So that has been a model contribution, as has the style in which you've done it. Friendship, openness, a personal commitment to transparency, which sets the tone, and a sense of your door always being open to anybody. So we will really miss you, but we will carry on the work. You've shown us how to do it, and we will try to live up to the standard that you set. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Heather. Yeah, it's a long time since July 1981. And as I was watching the Thatcher Years series, they took me back to those times. And inevitably you reflect when you come into the end of your career on where you started and what it was like. And I thought, well, we live in quite interesting, challenging times at the minute. And then I watched the Thatcher Years in 1981 and reminded myself quite what the environment was like then, with riots in various major cities across the country all summer and various other 3 million unemployed. And to start your career in an inner city social security office in the summer of 1981 was being thrown in at the deep end by any stretch of the imagination. But it's been hugely enjoyable and rewarding career, and I've had the great fortune to work with great people, you know, and the FSA is a really good exemplar of working with committed and capable and skilled professionals that go above and beyond, as we've seen at the minute, as Colin mentioned right at the beginning of the meeting. We have a number of people, tens of people, going above and beyond this last 3 weeks in relation to managing incidents. And the 3 incidents that you mentioned that happened in the first few months of taking over as chief exec, you know, the organisation's ability to be able to respond to that is a tribute to the dedication and professionalism of the people that work in the organisation. So it's been a great privilege and pleasure to finish my 38-year career leading the FSA, I shall continue to follow all the activities. I promise not to submit any board questions from. We've got a question from Jason of Leeds who'd like to know, and another one, and so I promise not to submit any questions. But just to say, thank you to the board, past and present members, for their support and challenge. It's appreciated by me and the executive, and the right balance that you strike with that. My thanks to Heather for her support for the executive, and for me personally. It wouldn't have been possible to make the progress we've made and the preparations we made for EU exit without Heather's personal input. And my thanks to as well to my EMT colleagues who've been very patient and good-humoured in terms of supporting my leadership over the last few years. But mostly to say thank you to all the staff in the organisation. The organisation is only as good as the commitment of its people. And we have exceptional people in the FSA. So I'm very confident that the organisation will go on to even bigger and better things in the coming years. And I think we've laid the foundations for it to be very successful. So thank you very much.
We have now got time for public questions, and I'm looking for Stephen, who's not in the room. Who's coordinating? Thank you. There's a lady there who'd like to ask a question. If you'd like to say your name and an organisation, if you have one.
Thank you. I'm not from an organisation. I'm Pat Brown. I'm an ordinary, interested consumer, or member of the public, I should say. In view of the fact that the hygiene rating scores for food premises tend to be lower in England than in Wales and Northern Ireland, my question is about the progress regarding the mandatory display of scores on the doors in England to, sort of mirror Wales and Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Pat, what an absolutely top question, and one that we are very happy to answer. Maria, do you want to pick that up? And I will just start by saying we are absolutely with you around this board table about wanting mandatory display and knowing the benefits that come from it.
Thank you, Heather. Yes, indeed. One of the things that has held us back from pushing forward in bringing legislation to Westminster was all of the legislation that we had to bring forward in preparation for EU exit. So now that we have that programme of work finished, we will be moving at pace, working through the processes involved in taking forward mandatory display.
So we aren't in control of that timetable, but we are in control of getting the case in front of ministers, and that's what we're working hard to get done as soon as possible. Thank you. Any other questions in the audience? No, thank you. Pat, I can't tell you how thrilling it is for somebody to come and ask us that question, a member of the public. That's why we meet in public. Thank you very much for being here. I want to ask the board now, that is the close of the board meeting, but we are ahead of time. So are you happy for us to romp forward into the business committee? Because there won't be anything to eat if we go outside anyway. Yep, good. Right, in that case, we're now reconvening as the business committee. And we will start with the well, I'll just register again, Rod's apologies, and the minutes of the 13th of March meeting. Are we happy to accept those as the record? And the actions arising, only one outstanding action, I think, which was the diversity information. I think that's happened though, hasn't it? We've had that in a board circulation, Maria. Diversity information, yes, we have. Yeah, so that's all completed. Jason.
Yes. I mean, we've talked about the significance of some of the prosecutions towards the end of my report, and the impact that they're beginning to have, we think, in terms of potential deterrence. Always difficult to measure deterrence, but you know, certainly it's drawn attention from across the sector. The nature of the the sentences and I think has refocused efforts in the sector in response to that, which is a positive thing. In terms of the spending review, we mentioned it earlier, we've submitted our initial response to the request from HMT and laid out some of the areas that we think we would like to focus on and where we think we may need additional investment. Picks up on some of the issues we discussed in the board meeting, for example, allergens, where we think there is certainly the strong potential for a very good business case around investment in that area and some of the costs it might prevent elsewhere across government. So I think we've got a good package of measures that we can take forward in discussions with the Treasury throughout the spending review, which will conclude in the autumn. I'm looking at Chris, but I think the current plan is it will conclude mid-autumn with final agreement towards the end of the year. We've also mentioned in the board discussions earlier the NAO report 2 or 3 times, and it was very encouraging to see the support that we got from the NAO and the recommendations that they attributed to us as FSA are all areas that we are already active on and well progressed on, a couple of which we've discussed at the board meeting earlier today. So very pleased with the nature of that working relationship that we've got with the NAO, and it's similar to what Colin was saying earlier, the relationship we've got with them on the accounts, and Mazars acting on their behalf as well. So I think it's important that we keep that positive relationship. And our pay strategy is just something I'll draw attention to because it's extremely important, as you might imagine, for our people. We are not unusual as a government department in our annual people survey receiving some fairly strong feedback about the pay and reward package that we offer our people, with less than 30% of our people happy with the pay and reward package that they've got. So we've been building a business case over the last year to seek permission to have more pay flexibility, so that we can use our money more flexibly than we're able to do now, and we're on the point of submitting that to Cabinet Office and subsequently to Treasury as well. So we've built the best case we can, and I think we're confident and hopeful that we'll get a positive response.
Thank you. Any questions for Jason on that Business Committee report? Dave?
Just one, if I may. Just looking at the prosecutions, there appears to be quite possibly a disproportionately large number of halal and businesses from the Asian community impacted in there. So I just kind of wondered how much we and our local authority partners were doing to ensure that our training materials and our guidelines were available in a range of the most suitable languages to ensure that everyone's got the very best opportunity to make sure they're meeting all of the guidelines that we're looking for as we become a more and more diverse and multicultural society.
The straight answer is, Dave, I don't know. Colin, do you know what range of languages?
It's something I can look at specifically in terms of language, but I mean, we are obviously out there in all those businesses, providing advice, dealing with enforcement, escalating as required. So, obviously, in the Business Committee report, there's a number of prosecutions highlighted there, and some of them are halal, some of them aren't. Actually, the number of prosecutions as a whole is more or less the same. The sentencing guidelines have changed, the numbers are bigger, but the numbers of prosecutions are broadly similar. Now, in terms of the split between halal and other, and in terms of the information, I'll look at that specific point in terms of language.
We should probably also just reflect that halal can include stunned and non-stunned, so there are some differences there as well. And certainly, if I think of some of the non-stunned establishments I've engaged with, that they're not necessarily owned and managed by people for whom English wouldn't be their first language in any case. So we'll get some data on that. Thank you. Anything else to pick up in Jason's report? Okay, thank you very much. In that case, we'll move on to our annual communications update. Stephen is joining us at the table. We have Justin. Oh, heck, Stephen, Justin, Sarah. Takes 3 members of the comms team to communicate their performance on comms. Just saying.
Change of tone of voice.
Right, now I've done my best to unsettle you. I'll hand over for you to...
and thanks for the opportunity to come and to provide the update to the board. I'm joined today by Justin Everard, who's Senior Head of External Communications, and my other deputy, Sarah Gibbons, who's the Senior Head of Corporate Engagement. So you may remember that back in March 2018, as a wide-eyed and relatively fresh-faced newcomer to the world of food and food safety, I presented what was then the Communications Direction of Travel. And I think one of the key messages I wanted to try and promote in that presentation was the importance of communications as a strategic partner in the delivery of the business priorities. So what we're going to try and do today is to reflect on what we've been up to since that time, think a little bit about the context in which we're operating now and in the future, and then to think about what the challenges are for us moving through the course of the next 12 months and beyond. So if we start off with the context, so we know that public trust still remains low in particular institutions, particularly government and the media. That's not just a domestic phenomenon, it's also a global challenge. EU exit has brought an additional layer of scrutiny, quite intense scrutiny, both to the organisation itself, but across government and across other parts and other sectors. And that, again, will only increase, or at the very least be maintained. Obviously, to consumers, food and food safety is such an important issue, such an emotive and important issue to those groups. And that brings with it then a high level of media interest, and that is constant. But it does spike from time to time and become much more intense, and the level of scrutiny goes off the charts. And we're currently in that mode at the moment, dealing with the Listeria incident, and Justin will touch on that more in a moment. I think going back to the EU exit, what's interesting is if we look at an issue such as chlorine-washed chicken, it's actually a totemic issue against which providing the backdrop for the entire debate around trade and around standards. So we are at the front and centre of not just the food issue, but the whole knock-on effect that can have on trading relationships and partnerships and where that takes us. So whether we like it or not, front and centre stage is where we are going to be both now and in the future. So over to you, Sarah, to tell us a little bit more about context.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. So a little bit more about trust. So while trust as a whole is low in government and in institutions and in the media, we are in a great position in that we very much buck that trend. I'm not going to go through all the statistics here in detail, but the one thing I would highlight is our standing in the RepTrak survey. So this is an independent assessment of reputation among a range of public sector organisations, and we are now 11th in that list of 70 organisations, in touching distance of the top 10. So that's a really, really great place to be. Perhaps the more interesting question, though, is what we do to maintain that, given the context that Stephen has outlined. And I think there, what we really have to bear in mind is another sort of piece of the landscape around trust, and that's the rise in trust, in fact, of experts and of scientists. And I think over the next 12 to 18 months, a key priority for us has to be doing what we can to bring our science to the foreground, to bring our technical experts to the foreground in how we engage consumers, the public, and the media.
Thanks very much, Sarah. We know how vitally important it is to work across the three countries to give equal weight to what happens in Belfast and Cardiff as well as what happens in London. In 2018, we put in place a new communications agreement with our colleagues in Belfast and Cardiff, which, while sharing common working practices and understanding, also recognises the difference in policy areas and the external landscape there. Now, this has been in place for about 7 months or so, and I think is working pretty well. One of the areas where we come together as a one communications team is when we have incidents, and Stephen touched on the Listeria incident, and this is a good example of when the chips are down and when the comms work really does come into its own. As well as dealing with the 100+ comms inquiries we get every day, over the last 3 weekends, while we've been dealing with the Listeria incident, we've put in 56 hours across those 3 weekends. And this is 56 hours not of just giving journalists a line that we have already. It's also dealing with difficult, intrusive, sometimes aggressive lines of questioning from senior journalists from across the piece. And of course, if you get it wrong, then of course it's very visible that you've got it wrong, and everyone can see it on the front page of the Daily Mail the next day. So it's a tough and important job to do right. And we do this with a relatively small budget and with a relatively small number of people. In terms of resources, when you compare us with our peers across the food landscape, we are relatively smaller than them and have a lower budget. Moving on to our achievements, thank you. I'm delighted that we've now got 2 awards for our Easy to Ask campaign, and this is added to the 11 award nominations for our consumer campaigns during the last year. And I'll just quickly pick up on the Easy to Ask campaign, because this was something which was relatively new area for us. It was a niche campaign for 16 to 24-year-olds, and unusually we used almost exclusively social media to engage with our audience on this, and also we brought in a popular influencer, who's a man called Jack Fowler, who was on the last series of Love Island. Not someone I was particularly familiar with beforehand, but I follow him avidly now. And he himself is an allergy sufferer, and I think it helps us get real cut-through. And real cut-through on Instagram, which is very much the channel which is used by younger people. We've also reset our media relationships. So we have more and deeper and more cooperative relationships with journalists than we did in the past. However, we are also much quicker, much sharper to go back and correct it when they get things wrong. So we've had recent instances of this, of getting in touch with the Telegraph, for example, and the Grocer, who, if they get their facts wrong or the headlines wrong or or the body of the text, we want to be much sharper and quicker in getting those corrections made. Thank you very much, and it's over to Sarah.
Thanks. I'll just add to what Justin has said with a few reflections on internal engagement. I'm not going to talk in depth about our engagement scores because I know Maria's going to talk about that later in the day. But one really important thing for me on the internal comm side is that our work has to be in partnership and thinking about how we drive up those engagement scores. And I think in terms of the levels of engagement that we're getting with our content, we're certainly in the right place there. Another point is really about how in internal comms we think about how we support our colleagues and staff to advocate effectively for the work of the organisation, and where we do very, very targeted campaigns now, so particularly our work on EU exit internally, we are seeing a huge increase in levels of confidence across the organisation in how our staff and colleagues are able to go and explain our role and what we're doing post-exit to external stakeholders and wider.
On to the next one. So partnerships and stakeholder engagement are really, really important part of what we do, working with stakeholders and businesses to amplify content and call on and identify trusted voices. That's a job for everybody in the organisation, particularly at the senior levels, the stakeholder engagement, the management of relationships, the management of partnerships, and we do it well. From the communications to communications point of view, we've worked quite hard at trying to build up relationships, for example, with the some of the trade bodies. And that's helped us when it comes to announcements around, say, AMR or Campylobacter, to have discussions about how we'll react to it, to give each other a heads up on certain issues that may arise, and for us to build some third-party voices of support or clarification on certain and particular issues. Justin has mentioned Easy to Ask. The partnerships with the charitable sector, the Allergy UK and Anaphylaxis, were very good and absolutely essential to the effective delivery of that campaign in terms of reaching target audiences. We support the business to do the business of engagement with help with content, collaboration and coordination. So again, the 2 big priorities over the last few years, EU exit and ROF, we've played a fundamental part, not just on the communications of it, but helping the business to do that engagement. Guidance for industry on EU exit, and Michael has already mentioned today the digital registration of businesses, which has been an important part of the work that we've been supporting. Social media, obviously an important and an area of growth, and an area of growth for us over the last 12 months. We've built a stronger presence, building up our followers in key platforms and achieving higher engagement levels. On the right-hand side of the slide there, you'll see some guidance that we developed for the organisation called Caveat, which is there to try and ensure that content is consistent, it's the right style and tone, and it's properly targeted. I've highlighted 3 platforms there, all where we're starting to see a push up in the numbers. Justin has mentioned Instagram, so we know from the discussions we've had with digital companies that Instagram is seeing a massive, absolutely massive growth in use as a platform amongst that young age group, the Generation Zers, the 16 to 24s. This is where they are at the moment. This is where they're having the conversations. This is where they're sharing content. So we've got a bit of work to do. We've doubled the numbers on that, but we recognise we've got a bit of work to do to get ourselves into that space. Easy to Act definitely helped get the toehold. What we need to do now is to think about how we formulate our content to reach some of those audiences that perhaps we've found more difficult to reach before. 2 other interesting areas for us are YouTube. Thinking about the FSA Explains campaign, it had 38,000 click-throughs over the course of last year, which is round about over 100 a day. So that's a very, very important part of our reaching consumers. And we tend to trigger things at the moments that matter. So if there's something that's particularly relevant in the news, we will trigger one bit of our FSA Explains content that's relevant to that issue, and that's when we tend to see some spikes, etc., in people clicking through to find out a particular issue, whether it's nitrates in bacon, FHRS ratings, etc. And LinkedIn, another area where I think there's some real opportunities. We've really increased our numbers on LinkedIn. We've got around 39,000 followers on that platform, and I think there's some real opportunities for us to use that space over the course of the next 12 months or so. So, thinking about the future. Strategically, obviously, our departure from the EU and what that will bring in terms of the levels of scrutiny, particularly around risk assessment, risk management, and really importantly for us, risk communication. And I think the levels of scrutiny there may well be unprecedented in terms of its constancy and what that will bring to the organisation. The good news is I think we'll be able to amplify our reputation for excellence in the science and evidence-based policy-making space. I did a quick speech last week to the intake of new scientists and experts that are coming into our scientific advisory councils, 35 or so, and it's excellent that we've got that group of people and that expertise for us to call on in terms of briefings, in terms of explanation of the work that we do. And of course, the organisation next year celebrates its 20th anniversary, and the opportunities that that may bring as we develop our next set of strategic priorities. What that means in terms of brand FSA, who we are, what we do, what people know us for, what we want to be known for, and of course, continuing to build trust and trustworthiness.
Thank you, Stephen. And looking also to the future, thinking about the, you'll have seen the part of the slide on the left, the corporate priorities, and then on the right you'll see the key areas of focus that we're looking to focus on during the course of 2019-20, and underpinned, of course, by our consumer-facing campaigns on the right-hand side. We're absolutely clear about supporting business priorities across communications. And our role, we see our role, as we touched on earlier, as strategic partners, working with colleagues to achieve common objectives. So picking up on a couple of these areas here, we're going to be looking to support domestic and international engagement for the FSA. We're going to build further on our engagement platforms, and also continue the good work on ROF, as it continues to be one of our key priorities, national inspection strategies, regular register of food business, and so on. So these are the key areas of focus that we look to as we go forward through the year.
Yeah, so that's a little bit on the what and a little bit on the how as well. So what we're going to do to improve our impact. So I think the key thing for us over the next 12 to 18 months is very much thinking about how we target our communications and develop a very much an audience and user-led approach to everything we do. So that means thinking about our big platforms, food.gov, and our internet platform, the digital workplace. How do we build in a user-led approach to how we organise content? Social media presence, so not just thinking about the numbers of followers that we have, but how we use those channels effectively to target the audiences we really need to reach, and pushing the boundaries very much in terms of development of creative content, making our content engaging and relevant to the audiences that we want to reach. And really, really importantly, thinking about partnerships and how we work in partnership with other organisations who can help us reach those audiences. And often when we have quite a small team, have perhaps the resources and reach that we don't have to really, really amplify our campaigns, and particularly when we're thinking about how we reach consumers.
Okay, so I realise that has been a real skate through. I think we've come in under 15 minutes. And the reason I brought Sarah and Justin with me is because I've got a tendency to go on a bit too much, so they've managed to keep us on time. Before we do go on to cover questions, because I realise it was a skate through, we haven't managed to cover all of the content in the slides. And there may be some areas that you would want to probe or comment on that perhaps didn't feature within the slides. But before we go on to that, I would just like to echo my thanks to the team, to the communications team, and the support that they've given me in the time that I've been here. Justin mentioned about the incidents, and that's really important, but there's a whole raft of communications work that goes on all year round. It is worth mentioning the incident handling. It is a lonely place to be at 1 o'clock in the morning when you've got a national media outlet banging the door for a particular line to take, and you're young and you're an inexperienced communications professional, and you know what the consequences of that can be. That service is there and we're providing it, and I want to say a massive thanks to the members of my team that provide that and go the extra mile day in, day out to make sure that the reputation of the organisation is protected and preserved. So thank you to the team, and thank you again to the support that we do get from colleagues at those difficult times. That's really valuable, because we can't make the message up. The message needs to be based and grounded on the facts, and people do pull out all the stops to make sure that we're able to respond accurately and swiftly. So thank you.
Stephen, thank you very much. I think we'd all endorse that appreciation for sure, and lots of nodding heads around the table. Anything that anybody wishes to pick up and pursue out of that column?
Chair, thank you. Stephen, team, thank you very much indeed. Really good presentation, and clearly tremendous progress made in a relatively short space of time. I'm just interested to probe a little bit more, and you did talk about the 3 countries as you went through that. I'm just keen to probe on as we go across the 3 countries, what are we doing about joined up government? Because an awful lot of what we need to do, the FSA can't do on their own, so we do need to work with other agencies and partners. What are we doing on communication across government? And aligned to that, are there any areas of learning from Wales, from Northern Ireland, from England that we could share and replicate across the other countries?
Okay, that's a very, very important question. I think we have worked, particularly communications, and I think across the organisation we've worked very hard at building the relationships and the connections with other part of government. So if I think about the incident that we're currently experiencing, certainly from the communications point of view, we are working absolutely hand in glove with partners in Public Health England, in the NHS, in DHSC, number 10 and other parts of government. And I would say in quite difficult and challenging circumstances, that has worked well, and it has been constructive, at times challenging, at times difficult. So we need to be able to make sure we can continue those relationships in peacetime. And I think, again, we as a team have visited 2 or 3 government departments for a senior team to senior team conversation about shared areas of interest and how we work together. What we try to do with the working arrangement across the 3 countries is to make sure that all of our colleagues in Belfast and Cardiff are plugged into what's happening across the wider organisation, but then that's also a two-way process, so that we understand if there's a particular challenge that we may need to address in those specific countries, that we're able to help that. There's an interesting, there's a real push in the central profession in government on the union and making sure that the countries work closely together. I gave a presentation in Belfast to the Northern Ireland Communications Forum, which is a grouping bringing together communicators from across the public sector in Northern Ireland, and that is a really sort of positive, good group that's trying to make sure the connections across government are being made. And we continue, the colleagues in Belfast continue to contribute towards that actively. I think that's on its way in Wales, and we'll make sure that we're represented there, and we take advantage of those forums to make sure that the FSA voice is heard, and that we understand what the local challenges are.
Just maybe if I could build on that, wearing both my communications and my Wales hats, I think that it is very much a single team communications team, and recognising that in Wales and Northern Ireland and in England there may need to be different perspectives, different contexts. Again, Know Your Calories, you've got a different campaign running in there, but at the same time, comms professionals in Wales and Northern Ireland will be contributing to what is going on out of the London office. So it's very fully integrated with a local understanding as well. And that's the model that we've been trying to build up. It takes a little bit of management, but I think it is the optimum approach.
I'm going to ask something. Go on then, Guy. No, go on. I get the last word anyway, so it's all right.
No, I was just going to say that I think Stephen giving a talk at the induction of the new experts on our advisory committees last week, has gone down really well, and two is really important, because one of the things, and I know you're bound to say I would say this, but that trust figure, it is the academic scientists that are right at the top, and it's not government scientists or industrial private sector scientists that have that trust rating. So the fact that we have so many people from that category in our committees, and I'm not saying the others shouldn't be used, but we do have a high proportion from that background, we should use them a lot more, because they bring that real high trust value.
And the thing I was going to pick up was, I remember a couple of years ago, one of the frustrations for comms were lots of good things happening in the FSA and you were the last to get engaged, and sometimes having to fight to get engaged. I think what I'm hearing is that there's been a shift in that, and people's understanding of the value you add is encouraging them to get you involved in the thinking before they come and tell you what they would like you then to go and communicate for them. And I want to know, is that right?
I think that is right, yeah, absolutely. There's still work to do on that, but I think that idea of being a strategic partner, so trying to be there at the beginning of conversations, when people are starting to think very early about what they want to do, and try and look at some things through the communications lens is really important. We work to what's called the OASIS model, which is the government communications sort of template standard. It's nothing mystical, it's simply a plan, do, review model that's applied to communications. When we launched our plan last year, we also issued an offer and an ask of the department, and the offer was, here's what we can bring to you in terms of support as communications professionals, but the ask is that you come to us early, you really think about what the objectives are that you're trying to achieve, the O, think about the audiences that you want to try and land the messages with, A, the S is the strategy that we then develop around that. We then look at the implementation, the I, and then S is scoring and evaluation. And actually, that was really well received by colleagues. It was quite incredible how people liked the idea of the model. It got them into a thought process. We've workshopped some particular areas when people have come in having thought about objectives beforehand, rather than I'd like a leaflet or I'd like a page on the website. So yeah, I think there's been a step change, still plenty of work to do, but I think we're definitely in a better place perhaps than maybe we had been.
Thank you, Ruth.
I'm just trying to recall, have we commissioned the Science Council to do a piece on risk communication? Am I right in recalling that we were expecting more work from?
We commissioned them to do something which is how to communicate risk and uncertainty, and what we just talked about right at the start about asking them to go further and thinking about how we do present issues around uncertainty. So we've done that, and Steve will fill it in.
That's absolutely right. The follow-up work on risk communication is now being undertaken by ACSS, the Advisory Committee on Social Science, and we expect their report soon.
Just to welcome that, and obviously a great opportunity given the point you made about that's going to be one of your major pieces of work. So I just wanted to understand the timing of that output and how it might be used. Thank you.
I think I'll sum up then to say, first of all, if you chair the board, it sometimes takes quite a long time to work out if there's something the board want to know about somewhere, or are we getting the assurance we need in another place. That is not true of communications. You're the first to know if the board aren't happy about what's happening on communications. I can absolutely assure you. So my measure of success about our communications department is that it's not been mentioned to me in the last year by a board member. So I think that is slightly flippant way of saying I think there's a very strong level of confidence around this table and the leadership of the comms team and the impact you're having across the department. We recognise it's hard yards, and some of these things are difficult messages to deliver to a busy audience mind, and they aren't always the things that people want to hear. But I think the discipline you've brought and your level of engagement across the whole department is really showing dividends for us. So thank you very much for that. We should look forward to hearing more over the next few months, and anything we can do to help get across that message that our comms team adds real value, engage them early into the whole FSA. We'd be very happy to support that in any way that we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Review of staff engagement. Maria.
I'm hoping we'll be able to pull up the presentation. Great, thank you. This is the annual report to the board on staff engagement, and I think the very exciting first top headline is we are at a 10-year high in relation to our overall staff engagement score. As you know, we track this through our Civil Survey People Survey, and we have an overall engagement index of 64%. And it will come as no surprise to the board that there is a lot of detail and a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to help us with our maintaining our staff engagement. In fact, we're very close to some of the high-performing civil service departments. But the results, as you can see, give us a really good flavour of what we need to work on for 2019, and that includes, as Jason has already alluded to, our pay and benefits is a big issue for us. We score very poorly on it, and it's something that we're very focused on in relation to our staff engagement. The board will be aware that we are about halfway through delivering on a 3-year people strategy, and it has 3 key strands, but many of the strands of work that fit under staff engagement and are achieved through the first of our strands of work, building a highly effective, resilient organisation. And that includes embedding our Aspire values, and you've heard about our Aspire values, and we talk about them all the time. We have been trying to make sure that our staff understand and live our Aspire values, and that's our expectation of our staff. And we have been working very hard on a number of campaigns throughout 2018 to embed the Aspire values. Particularly, we concentrated this year on our resilience value, as you would imagine, and we've produced a guide to resilience, what is the expectation on resilience for the FSA. We've also incorporated some mental health and wellbeing advice for our staff as well, and we have had events around that. But one of the key things that we have done in 2018 is change our management conversations, and this has been very, very important. We've achieved it through introducing a new performance management system, and we've really shifted the focus to strength-based conversations between our managers and members of staff, and those conversations, the expectation is that they would happen at least every 6 weeks. We also launched our diversity and inclusion strategy in August of 2018. We have committed to champion inclusivity through our management community, which is a really key group for us, our frontline managers. And we also want to embrace and support staff networks. Our aim here is to strengthen obviously our diverse and inclusive culture. We set up our Diversity Council, and the Diversity Council is drawn from members across our employee networks and also other people who have expressed an interest in joining the council. And Jason is our senior champion at the moment for our Diversity Council. We also have a number of inclusion champions within the executive management team and within our senior leadership team, so that we're setting the expectation from the top of the organisation. As I've said, we're supporting our internal staff networks. They provide really invaluable insight for us from employees. It's a really safe space for lots of concerns to be aired, and also those networks are coming up with their own solutions that we can implement in the business. In 2018, we also changed the way we recognise and reward staff. So we have introduced individual and team cash awards for work of excellent quality. And we also have Aspire vouchers, and those are just small cash acknowledgements of where we see excellence in terms of staff demonstrating the Aspire values. We concentrated as well in the last financial year on managing change. It's one of the things that we continue to hear from our staff, that they feel that we don't manage change in the way that we should. So we're really focused on, again, becoming one of the civil service high-performing departments in this area. And we've introduced a simple Fit for Change 3-step process. We've trialled this within the business. We've had really good feedback, so in 2019 we'll be embedding this Fit for Change model, and we'll be making sure that it's used consistently across the business. So just looking forward then to 2019-20, we've committed to submit our pay bid to Cabinet Office, as Jason has already said. That really is to deal with some of the inequalities and the anomalies that we have within our current pay structures. We also will continue to embed our Aspire vouchers as one of our core elements of staff engagement, champion our diversity and inclusion work, and also continue to embed the Aspire, continue to embed the Fit for Change model. So I hope that gives reassurance to the board that we're firmly focused on our staff engagement. We listen and we act on the feedback that we get, and what we're really trying to set out to do is provide the best working environment that we can for our people. Thank you.
Maria, thank you very much. Observations, questions, warm endorsements? Mary.
Warm endorsement. I mean, you know, those numbers are a tremendous achievement, and also just in recognition of Jason do coincide with his period as Chief Executive, so I really want to acknowledge him and the whole team. And certainly this is my first engagement with any government department, and I've been so impressed by the quality of the people interactions. I find it very, very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin.
No, I'd like to give an equally warm endorsement. I think that the early slides, the improvements in the graphs that are very visible, particularly over the last 2 years, and to be so close now to the very high-performing departments. One question for that, I mean, obviously we've changed the way we engage with our staff very positively. Has there been sufficient training provided, and what training has been provided to managers to actually engage in those very open and clearly very successful conversations?
Yes, we provided a very comprehensive training package for our managers, because it is a different way to have a conversation. We've introduced strength-based conversations for our managers, and we provided a whole training package around that, so everyone got trained, and we also then top up that training as required. There's also documentation and guidance provided as well, so that you can go back and have another look at it when you need it.
No, well, I think that clearly this shows that this is a very high-performing government department. It just hasn't been fully recognised in the figures yet, but I think it's only a matter of when that happens. Well, so well done.
Right. Colm, I would agree. I think the thing I liked most in this whole pack was having these check-in conversations. That is just when you kind of look internationally at leading people management organisations, this is what they're starting to do, and it's just so much more effective. But to introduce that within a civil service structure will have been a big ask. I'm not sure many departments will be doing that. So it's superb to see it there, and look forward to seeing the impact of it. Ruth.
I think just to echo, huge achievement and well done for that, and also to really welcome the commitment to diversity and inclusion and the personal leadership that Jason's put to that, as well as the directors, and to really endorse that going forward, and that we make sure we maintain progress on that area.
Guy?
I just had a question. When one looks at the 10-year trend data, you quite rightly point out the the pay and benefit thing lagging, and something's going to be done about that. I mean, do we have this level of granularity about what a high-performing department looks like? So the trends there are the same, but that pay and benefit one is that bit higher, so therefore if you address that, you will join that cohort.
Not surprisingly, pay and benefits does score lower across all the government departments. So yes, we do have that information, Guy. But you're right. I think it's about how our staff feel about what the leadership is doing about pay and benefits. You know, they very much recognise that there are constraints. Of course, there are across the civil service. But I think we really needed to demonstrate that we were doing the best that we could to make it fairer for them.
I'll just come in on the back of that. I think an area that we've done in addition to what Maria's just taken us through is, and Maria being very modest about this, in terms of delivering the other aspects of our ways of working. So I think there are few more flexible departments than ours are as well supported in terms of the technology options that people have. So I think when you see the kick up on the pay and benefits, it's more on the benefits side than the pay side, and the benefits of the flexible working packages that we offer. And I think, again, that's an area where I think we're at the forefront of government departments. I think we're at the forefront in terms of the work that we've done on how we have conversations with our people about how they're performing. I think although we still have end of year in the SCS, so it's a constant feature of my 38 years is an end-of-year appraisal and mid-year reviews. It's not the case now, so it's a huge change, as Heather says. So, I think there's probably, as always, more we can do in terms of flexibility and supporting our people in options and choices about how and where they work. But the key next step is to address the pay issue. You can't get away from the pay issue fundamentally. You can do all the other stuff, but it still come back down to, do I think I'm being properly rewarded for the effort I'm putting in? And we've heard lots of warm words around the table today about different teams putting in and going above and beyond. Well, sometimes you have to back that up.
Maria, is there anything else that you'd look for from the board or board members? I'm not saying you definitely need us for anything, to help you continue the momentum in this direction.
I mean, I think if I had one ask, I think we could think very carefully about how the board members could help us with diversity and inclusion, because it's the one area that I think we continue to need to really, challenge ourselves on, and push forward on, and look at excellence as well across public and private sector to drive, best practice.
And also I should thank Ruth. She's already volunteered to get involved with the Women's Network, so she's already there, but also about to co-opt Mary. And Heather. So there are plenty of opportunities, and I think it is important for the board to be seen, to be part of the D&I programme as well.
I think everybody would be really delighted to do anything that you think. Don't think you have to just have us all just because of the sake of it, but we're at your service to help however we can on that. And my other final comment would be, I've worked in organisations which do change management as a kind of an entire client service delivery, and we mustn't flog ourselves to get an unrealistic score on change management, because you never find anywhere that anybody thinks is brilliant at change management. So I know we want that to be better, but we shouldn't have unrealistic expectations about what percentage better would be.
One final one for me. What's really pleasing for me as I leave is the fact that we've found the time, effort and energy to devote to all these activities in and amongst all the other things that we're doing as well. These are key enablers in terms of the effort we put into our people, and I'm really pleased that the team have not lost sight of the fact that you have to put a huge amount of effort into your people if you want to deliver all the other stuff. If you want to do the EU exit stuff and the ROF and allergens and FHRS mandation and everything else, you can't. And often I've worked in organisations where this drops off the agenda. It's one of the first things that drops off the agenda is everybody focus on the business deliverables. And I think that's testament to the exec team and Maria and our HR support teams that we've kept this firmly at the front of our priorities.
Thank you. Now, it's 12:30, and I reckon we've got about 45 minutes of business left. So it's your choice whether we are carrying on or breaking for some sandwiches, which will slowly get warm. But we're okay time-wise. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Can we all tolerate keeping going? You're allowed to do that. Right, excellent. Chris, Performance and Resource Report.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Unsurprisingly, we've already covered and touched on a large number of aspects in the report, so I'll just bring out a few key items. In terms of EU exit, we've already mentioned on several occasions, and slide 12 shows that as far as is possible at the moment, the FSA is green on all the key projects within that programme. In terms of the second priority, ROF, we heard from Michael earlier on and Maria specifying the 4 key areas going on in that world, and slide 13 illustrates the various deliverables and progress in that programme more widely. Thirdly, in terms of the day job, there's just a few things to bring out. Slide 5, foodborne disease, obviously exactly what the FSA is primarily here to do, recognising it is industry's responsibility to ensure the food is safe. So the each of the 4 metrics there are within threshold, but as our policy colleagues have always said, we're monitoring that closely as well. So I just wanted to mention that. In terms of slide 6, FHRS, we've already had a question on that, and I think it's right to point out that as recognised, Northern Ireland and Wales showed the quickest improvement in the number of 5 ratings after mandation. And again, we've mentioned the NAO report, and that again is mentioned in relation to mandation in England, which again Maria's already mentioned. And then finally, just building on what Colm said earlier about Iraq, whilst the annual report and accounts aren't all completely finalised, we have come in again within all our relevant limits for resources. And that's all I want to say. Questions?
Chris, thank you. I will just note that the board is, I think, in September having an update on Campylobacter, so we'll have an opportunity to look at in more detail at the performance there in the September meeting. Mary.
Is there anything to read into the, I mean, I know we had these numbers at the last meeting. Is there anything to read into the fact that on all of the foodborne illness there's been a little uptick? And I know short term, but, you know, is this a focus on EU exit, or, you know, is this an impact, a general impact that we should be mindful of?
No, I mean, those that are nearer to this, such as Rebecca and Guy and Steve, may want to build on this, but certainly I think that, as Guy has rightly pointed out on many occasions alongside others, there is a certain amount of volatility in these numbers, and you'll see that whilst there is an uptick, it's not statistically significant. So certainly in terms of as our role as a regulator, we'll keep a close eye on this and make sure industry is doing what it needs to be doing.
So I think that each of the, if you look at each of the foodborne pathogens individually, they're within the range of year-on-year variation we would expect, but to have all 4 going in the same direction at the same time just really, I think, gives us cause to ask whether there are any underlying causes, and that's what we're doing with public health organisations across the UK, recognising there may be human-related factors or vulnerability factors that are changing as well, recognising that for some of these pathogens, such as Campylobacter, there may be non-food sources where we probably aren't as close to understanding what has happened. So just really probing, because as I say, although each of them individually is within the tolerance, within the range we would expect, we just want to check there's no underlying cause. So that's what we're doing at the moment. On Campylobacter, as the Chair said, we'll report back to you specifically at the September meeting.
Just to welcome that, I think it's right at this stage to just start to ramp up the interest and investigation. I note on Listeria, we can do things now in terms of connecting cases that we wouldn't be able to do 10 years, 15 years ago. Are the public health agencies applying a similar approach to other infections? Because it may be we can get a different perspective on what might be driving these cases. Are we confident they're using the latest techniques to try and read across these areas?
Yes, and we've tried to smooth the data to allow for differences in detection. PHE changed methodology for Campylobacter a couple of years ago, and we've tried to take that artifactual effect of the change of methodology out of the figures and make the time series real in that sense. But we, as I say, we just need to understand whether there is something underlying going on that causes the number of all cases to increase. In terms of whole genome sequencing, I think that leads there to be more incidents than you would expect from if the number of overall cases remained constant, because it allows you to link together using that technology cases that may be geographically or temporally spread, whereas in the past you would have just seen them as individual sporadic cases. I don't think whole genome sequencing on it by itself would lead you to expect the number of cases overall to increase. So you need to look for human effects, methodological effects, non-food effects, and then ask whether there are some real changes in terms of food processing or food practice that underlie this increase of all four at the same time.
I was just going to flag, and Chris raised it earlier, in terms of actually detecting a kind of a public health impact of what you've done is notoriously difficult because it's very noisy data sets. I mean, if anyone is interested in what success looks like, look at the Salmonella figure here, which is an indication of the incredible success of vaccinating chickens and various other work that went on in that, which resulted in us changing a recommendation to do with runny eggs. And that is a figure which is a real rarity. But we shouldn't sort of not, point it out, in fact, that there you have a clear direction of travel, and there might be a slight uplift now you're talking about. But what we should be doing, which has been raised, is kind of setting aspects of a percentage change which triggers us to pay more attention to something, to ramp up then the detection or the trying to see if there's a real signal there. The problem with that is it may well take some time before, after ramping up, you can kind of detect that because of the time lag in what we're doing here. I suppose I think the discussions we've had previously about not going down a route of having a KPI with a very precise number on it, this is beginning to show why that wouldn't have been a very good idea, and how we're approaching it is the right way.
Thank you. I think when we do get into any more detail, when we have that data, we must always bear in mind also population growth, changes in consumption. There could be just reasons for this being exactly no change in trend, just a change in volume. Anything else, Mary?
On the slide 9, which is the animal welfare non-compliances, I'm just wondering whether just to put, because it's a sort of messy set of data, I'm wondering whether it would be helpful to compare each of those charts with last year's figure, so that we can see if there are any seasonal things or any changes over time.
We'll go in and have a look at how you get some information about that without... We used to have about 10 slides on animal welfare data, and then we couldn't see anything.
I'll certainly take that away, but what the headline figure is, the figure was 11,000 this year, it was 16,000 last year, so it's down overall.
Just be helpful to know that.
And we should also note 100% compliance with the CCTV regulation, which is a very welcome step. Excellent. Nothing else then? Chris, well done for managing the money. In a volatile financial year, that is a real achievement. We don't know how you do it, but we like the magic.
Thank you. Team effort.
Thank you. We're moving on now to update on the cutting plant and cold store review recommendations. Simon, welcome. Colin's going to begin.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So this is an update. It's our first update since the report, the joint report by FSA and FSS that was presented to the boards in October of last year. Board members will recall there were 19 recommendations. They were divided in terms of different periods of completion. They were divided amongst different stakeholders, whether that be ourselves and FSS, recommendations also for industry and local authorities. And the implementation between the two organisations, the FSA covering the 3 countries and FSS, has been in parallel but separate. So obviously different governance arrangements there, but we have been comparing notes and keeping in touch with our colleagues in Scotland, and a number of the recommendations have involved joint inputs between the two organisations. Obviously you have a short paper and a template summarising progress against each of the recommendations. Just a couple probably to draw out. Recommendation 5 in terms of information sharing initiative, which has been rolled out to many of the large producers in poultry and now in red meat. We can give you an update on that. It doesn't replace our unannounced inspections or audits. It adds to our understanding. Another one to draw attention to would be recommendation 7, which is the participation in a trial to evaluate a unified approach in a geographic area, delivering official controls collectively, and participation from Wrexham and Cornwall local authorities. I think it's also important to say at the outset that this work within the cutting plant and cold store review and the outworking of the recommendations is really part of it's a subset of a wider piece of work, which is around looking at the overall operations transformation work in terms of where we're going with official controls more widely. That is partly impacted by the EU Regulation 625 of 2017, with an implementation date of December, and so there's work to be done in that space, and also that these recommendations can be absorbed into the wider work, and some of that's reported in the template where looking at the wider piece of work, which is the end-to-end, if you like, we have thought for something like training and learning and development, that it's best looked in the round across the piece rather than just in terms of for cutting plants and cold stores. And so I think it's also a flag at this stage that we are starting to unpack that wider piece of work in terms of operation transformation and the wider delivery of official controls. And it's probably best that when we come back a second time with these, with an update, that we give you that bigger picture at that juncture.
Colin, thank you. Committee members? Mary.
Just an observation on recommendation 8, the discovery work with relation to BRC. Now, I'm not clear what the landscape looks like in terms of third-party or auditors, private auditing there, but just remembering that BRC isn't the only game in town.
I just wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about the impact of the official controls review on the load that we're bearing in this area, because it also reflects on the drive you're taking to embed this within the joined-up programme approach for reform. Yeah. But we do need to know, and board members might not be quite up to date on the official control review.
Yeah, so the official control review is something that has been ongoing for some months, and really, I suppose in this financial year that we're now well into in terms of coming towards the end of the first quarter, our targets are our main activity needs to be around the service delivery partner contract, which expires at the end of March in 2020, and in terms of the official control review work in terms of the official control regulations for 625 that I mentioned. That really is our priority for this year. We of course want to progress this as best we can, and there's then the wider longer term work in terms of what we might introduce in the next contract, the service delivery partner contract, in terms of trials and feasibility studies to test some ideas for a longer term development of the future direction of official controls. So that work is ongoing. We're working to develop an implementation plan to cost that with a business case, but there are some immediate priorities that we need to achieve and deliver on by the end of this financial year.
Sorry, Simon.
Thanks, Chair. And just to add to Colin's points, I think we do believe it's possible to, in reflect in any ITT for the new contract, there's sufficient flexibility to allow us to accommodate any changes we might need to make as a consequence of OCR, or actually any changes we might need to make as a consequence of our operational transformation review.
Looks like we're done on that. Thank you very much. We shall look forward to further reports and seeing the integration into the overall programme leadership approach. Thank you. Catherine. EU exit, update on, as is traditional, not possible to write a paper.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to be here on behalf of Rod to present a remarkably brief paper for such a very incredibly large subject that's occupied so much time and so much effort in a very sustained way over a very long period of time, or maybe I'm just reflecting on how it's felt being in the eye of the storm. I think what it's very important to distinguish in bringing forward this paper is this is very much about providing a formal closure to the programme of work that we set up in relation to EU exit to do some very specific things and to deliver some very specific products. And I think the paper and the schematic at the back of it shows very clearly how incredibly well we rose to that challenge and did put in place those things that we said we were going to do at the time that we said that we were going to do it. But I think we would be drawing false comfort if we were not to acknowledge the fact that this is, of course, not the end of EU exit. It has not gone away. It is going to be a thing that will need to be picked up again and reflected in our forward work plans. I think what is I would particularly draw attention to in relation to what we focused on here is that we've been able to put in place products that have actually stand us in very good stead for our future direction. So whilst EU exit has been the catalyst and has been a very sharp focus for our efforts, nevertheless, we have been able to build our capability, start a journey to create the type of organisation with the skill sets, resource and capability that we are going to need for the challenges of the future. So I think it is very much to our credit that we have laid some firm foundations here. The paper kind of speaks to those areas where we think we can think about those products and their handling in under three broad headings in terms of whether we're sort of regarding them as a thing that basically transfers into a business as usual standing and way of behaving. Some things that we're going to sort of put to one side for the moment but pick up again and keep under constant review, and things where we're going to need to be prepared to reactivate them. I think when I reflect on the journey that we went through in doing this, I think we were helped in two very significant ways, and ways which I suspect might not have been necessarily as available to other departments who've also been faced with these challenges. I think there was something to be said for the calibre of the people who worked on this, who really did give quite remarkable degrees of commitment and service in prioritising this and in delivering it. And we've heard so much already around how well invested in our purpose our people are. But I think as well the fact that we were able to be focused on a very clear single point of perspective as to what we were about. We were not trying to second guess ministerial expectations and ambitions. We could be focused on a very clear point about our functions in relation to protecting public health and the other interests of the consumers. And that's really helped us to drill down and to maintain a minimum viable product approach, and I think has been absolutely fundamental to us getting to where we are today. So very happy to answer any further questions in relation to this, but as I say, I think we should, I suggest, hold in our minds the fact that as of the 19th of June, the only eventuality that's kind of actually there in law is exiting the EU on the 31st of October. Various remarkable things are going to have to happen to make that future scenario change. And I think we have to also remind ourselves that exiting on that date on the basis of no deal, I think is going to be more challenging to the food industry of this country than the premise of leaving it earlier, because it is just such a very trying time for them in the run-up to kind of Christmas production and Christmas activity. So I think this is, whilst we can rightly bank the products of the EU exit programme and regard that as a thing that we have delivered, as I say, this is not a subject that has gone away, and we will need to prepare to step back up certain areas of our activity, and I suspect sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed. It is very much that sort of pause point. Is there anything that board members wish to make sure we reflect on at this stage, or to be sure that we haven't lost sight of? Jason.
No, I think just the thing for the board to clock is the ongoing risk it poses to some of our other deliverables, simply because of the lack of legislative time that there is. So we've already talked about today potential legislative needs that we might have on the NFCU, on FHRS mandation, on sanctions, and on the official controls that we need to bring in. So, and the availability of parliamentary time and legislative slots to be able to deliver against some of those, it continues to be impacted by EU exit, and will continue to be impacted by EU exit. So it will be a break on our ambition on things like pace.
Mary.
Well, really want to thank the whole team for the work that you've done on EU exit. I know it's been absolutely brutal right round the organisation. And my impression in industry is that we've all kind of gone to sleep on it. You know, everybody was trying to get ready for the 29th of March and banking up stocks and banking up inputs and all of that. And my impression is there's a level at which, you know, you can't sustain either that economically that level of stocks, or, you know, that level of sort of organisational preparedness, and just wondering what additional burdens that may place on the FSA, and also really what input can the board provide to maintain the readiness of this organisation, you know, given all the noise from everywhere.
Thank you. Yes, no, I think you are absolutely right. I think this is an area where there has to be some concern, and it has been quite striking in the discussions that I've been party to with industry representatives, that when they themselves have reflected on how well industry was able to be prepared for these prior leave dates, there was an extent to which they did not think that response was terribly good, and now they're struggling with the fact that they were effectively seen to be not of their own making, crying wolf. So I think that there is a real issue for the industry to get engagement across the piece to drive up capacity to plan for this in a meaningful way, and I think we are certainly going to see that effort ramping up, probably with almost immediate effect, because, as I say, I think we have to accept that in the absence of more fundamental events, that's the thing that has to continue to be prepared for, and we are going to have to, I think, in particular, reflect on the capabilities we've developed around incident response, and everything is going to have to be absolutely front and centre in our thinking.
Colin.
Yeah, in terms of the incident and emergency response for No Deal, which is obviously a possibility towards the end of October, we are going to go back to where we were effectively if things don't change in the interim. And the working assumption is that we'll be probably standing up the team again at the beginning of October. I think that is obviously very much on my mind and colleagues' minds. But at the same time, I suppose the additional period has meant that there has been a degree of bedding in for the minimum viable products. So things like NFCU, the receipt and management system have been bedded in during the summer period.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you for being here. That concludes the public business of the Business Committee. As I mentioned at the start of the morning, there is unusually one item of closed business for the Business Committee, which is something that's commercially confidential. So I'm going to ask anybody who is not a member of the Business Committee if they wouldn't